Hello ladies and gentlemen, in this video I'll be commentating an entire playthrough of Viewtiful Joe. This is an Ultra V rated Rainbow V rank all film canisters run. If you haven't seen it already, I recommend watching my Devil May Cry commentary before this one. Both games share some similarities with each other, and Viewtiful Joe is the next title from the same director, Hidekimatic. I talked about a lot of different action game topics in that video, some of which apply to Viewtiful Joe, so I'll be referring back to it from time to time while reiterating as little as possible. Just like before, we'll start off with a history lesson while the intro plays out. Kamiya first discovered he wouldn't be working on Devil May Cry 2 when someone from another team approached him and asked him for the design document of the first, saying a different director would be making the sequel instead. Since Resident Evil 2 and Devil May Cry had both been tumultuous projects, Kamiya thought he might be getting fired or demoted, but that wasn't the case. A new group was formed with him as the director, the goal being to complete a smaller project in a short time frame which would boost their skills as developers. Apparently, the instruction from Shinji Mikami was to make something like Mega Man. Even though it was the third title he directed, Viewtiful Joe was the first time Kamiya designed a game totally from scratch, so the arcade influence shows through more clearly. What's interesting though is that Viewtiful Joe differs from typical beat-em-ups in substantial ways. Firstly, if you compare it to those other games, it's pretty long. Usually arcade machines have around half an hour of content, with a longer one maybe finishing up after an hour or so, probably because most players will give up before they get that far anyway. This playthrough lasts nearly 3 hours, and it's not as though I'm taking my time. Secondly, and maybe more importantly, it only supports a single player. If it had been designed for arcades, the pressure to implement a co-op mode would have been intense. Exclusively single-player arcade cabinets are the exception because the arcade itself is a social environment. People are more likely to continue spending if they're having a good time with their friend, too. Co-op was under consideration for Viewtiful Joe, but at some point it was dropped, which isn't that surprising because the gameplay is almost entirely 2D and includes time manipulation as a central mechanic. Most brawlers were built with 2D graphics but had 3D gameplay where players could move up or down as well as side to side. At times it was a little clunky, not being sure if you were totally lined up with an opponent, but it had a huge benefit because the extra space made co-op more enjoyable. If you imagine a co-op mode for Viewtiful Joe, players would need to be able to phase through one another or else they'd be colliding all the time, possibly getting each other killed. That happens in those arcade beat-em-ups too, but it's easier to avoid with that extra dimension. Max speed and slow-mo could also be frustrating to experience if you're not the one triggering them. That's not to say a great co-op mode is impossible in Viewtiful Joe, but there's more obstacles in the way than usual. So, even though it seems like Viewtiful Joe was Kamiya's opportunity to make an arcade game of his own, I wonder if he realised how lucky he was not to be working on actual arcade machines. He doesn't seem the type that crumbles to pressure, but that wouldn't stop a publisher from pulling the plug if they felt like releasing a single-player cabinet wasn't worth the investment. All of this is to say that Viewtiful Joe is an arcade title in some ways, just not literally. Of course, it has a well-earned reputation for difficulty, and if you've just finished my Devil May Cry commentary, then it's only been a couple of minutes since I talked about how arcade machines could be exploitive in that regard. That's true, but it's not the full story. In arcades, your number of attempts depends on how many credits you're willing to spend, so if a game is blatantly unfair, you can just walk away. Player retention is an important point if you're concerned about profitability. This is why the best ones often leave you with a sense that you could have done something else to survive. If it really was your fault, then maybe you'd pop in another coin and carry on. It's not really that simple, as there's only so much trial and error a single person will tolerate, but arcades weren't the cesspool of unfairness they've been made out to be either. The truth lies somewhere in the middle. Viewtiful Joe walks that ideal knife edge of difficulty and fairness, as we'll see going forward. This game is often credited as a Clover title, and much of Team Viewtiful would go on to work as part of Clover, but it technically isn't a Clover game. Later PlayStation 2 copies show the Clover logo for the startup segment, but the initial GameCube release just credits Team Viewtiful instead. The producer this time is Atsushi Inaba, who in an interview about Ōkami talked about that one being Clover's debut original title, showing he at least didn't consider Viewtiful Joe to be a Clover game. Of course, that distinction is of questionable importance, but I figured I'd take the opportunity to correct the record. By the way, the kanji in the Team Viewtiful logo isn't a real word, it's just a collection of characters which cause you to say Viewtiful if you read it a certain way. That form of writing is called ataji, which is an old-fashioned way of representing foreign words, although in a modern context you can think of it a bit more like slang. As you can see, the story is a flimsy pretext for conflict which takes the focus. We have a lot to get through, so I'll be skipping most cutscenes from this point, and I'll also be spoiling the ending only partway through. If you want to enjoy the story, you should go and do that before watching. Hopefully you've already played it for yourself anyway, but just in case, I'd like to take this opportunity to recommend it. You can always watch this video later. Since the start has the least stuff going on, it's the best time to explain some basic but less obvious mechanics that you might not be aware of even if you've played the whole thing. Maybe they had a similar train of thought while designing this level because it hints toward an important aspect of ranking during the very first ranked encounter. In order to get a Rainbow V, you need to break the pink box and collect the coin inside before dealing with the enemies. If you wait until afterwards, you'll get a worse rank, and since this happens early, before you even unlock slow-mo, there's only one possible explanation. Coins count towards your rank just as much as anything else, which turns out to be crucial during some later encounters. Of course, they could have just put that information in an explicit tutorial, but it's always more satisfying to figure things out for yourself, even if the game is secretly nudging you toward that revelation. When an enemy is put into a dizzy state, the sprites that appear around their head can either be stars or chicks, which isn't just a cosmetic difference. Chicks indicate that the stun duration will be doubled, a critical dizzy. This is useful information to have, but it's difficult to predict when a crit will occur during regular gameplay, which leads me to believe it's supposed to be random. Inconsistencies make combat unpredictable, which can impact fairness. In this case, it's not too bad since it only ever results in an increased stun, never a reduced one, but it runs counter to the rest of the design where these kinds of effects happen under direct player influence. There is one exception, however. On top of the base chance to get a crit, which is 1 in 5, you're guaranteed a crit if you cause 2 dizzies by dodging a frontal and backward attack within a split second of each other. This reveals another nuance. Dodging a frontal attack triggers the active portion of the enemy's animation, so even if they've only started winding up their fists, as soon as you tilt Joe the correct direction, they'll throw the punch. This compensates for the way they're animated, which is different from typical action games. Rather than relying on a lengthy anticipation which flows into an attack, the enemy will do a cartoony wind-up for a set amount of time, then throw their fist in the span of just a few milliseconds. At that point, there's no time to react, so the player is intended to dodge well beforehand. This is probably why Joe's dodge animation can be held for such a long amount of time, but having the attack happen right away improves the flow of combat anyway. If you've already shown you're going to dodge correctly, then there's no need to delay the inevitable, and skilled players are also rewarded by the ability to dizzy enemies more quickly. Most importantly though, it gives you a reliable way to handle high and low attacks coming from 2 directions at the same time. By dodging the side Joe is facing, you can force the first Bianchi to attack, then tilt the other way to avoid the one from the back. Doesn't work against all enemy types, but it's a useful little trick nonetheless. The intricacies of dodging become more obvious on Ultra V rated since the skull warning indicators are removed on this difficulty. It's a sweeping change that affects every encounter, even Captain Blue here. You're forced to pay attention to attack animations in a way which was optional before. What's fascinating about this is that combat would be tedious if you were forced to play this way the first time through. At best, you'd have to abuse the slow dodge against every enemy until you learned what their wind-ups are actually signalling, so it's taking advantage of the fact that you've already played before, which maybe justifies locking this difficulty to begin with. Compared to normal, one of the player's crutches is removed, boss health is doubled, abilities deplete more VFX, enemy damage is increased with most also gaining a slight health increase, and arrangements are changed to be more challenging. The parallels between Ultra V rated and Dante Must Die are obvious, only this time it's the beginnings of a pattern. Given that this game was primarily created to be a challenge, it seems fair to say that the developers were hoping for players to eventually overcome Ultra V rated, but this time I'd like to talk about the other side of the coin. Nobody starts out as an expert in anything, it can only come with knowledge and practice. It's unreasonable to expect someone with only a handful of casual games under their belt to hop into Viewtiful Joe and start tackling the higher difficulties. Easier modes have value, even for more hardcore titles like this. If you start out on kids and work your way up to Ultra V rated, then there's 3 major changes that happen along the way. First, the VFX meter drains twice as fast, then enemy layouts change, and finally, skull markers disappear. Overall, this is a great example of how to do escalating difficulty levels well, because each change is significant enough to matter, giving you an engaging new challenge to tackle, but they're also spread out enough not to be overwhelming. An ideal beginner mode doesn't just capitulate to a player's desire for something easier, it also helps train them for the next step. This encounter is another example of how important coins can be. Anytime a slot machine appears, you're expected to nab the payout or you won't get the best rank. Even though the slot machines seem to be deterministic, they rotate so fast as to be almost random from our human perspective. This can cause some irritation when you start chasing ranks, but once you adapt it's possible to beat them all consistently. The trick is knowing whether to stay in slow-mo or tap out of it and try again. You get a feel for it. Outside of enemy AI, this is one of the few arguably random gameplay components, which means, in theory, you could get so unlucky the time requirement becomes impossible to meet. That seems unlikely, and it never happened to me, but it's a quibble worth raising, I suppose. One of the more obvious ways this game follows on from Devil May Cry is the inclusion of juggling, although Joe has to be up close and personal to maintain it. There's not much you can do to an airborne enemy, but it does the job of isolating them, and if you get someone in the corner you can slow-mo aerial them, which looks pretty flashy. Considering what a big deal juggling was when DMC burst onto the scene, it's respectable to see it has such a reduced role in Viewtiful Joe. It probably took some restraint not to try repeating that past success too hard. Instead, it's just incorporated as a small flourish to the combat system. You don't even score any extra points for doing it. One cool aspect to launchers this time around is that some enemies have different reactions to them. This is why you won't see me launching any of these elite guys outside of slow-mo. Unless you hit them with a rock-on attack, they instantly retaliate with a dive kick. And yes, according to the manual, the targeted attacks are called rock-on attacks. Maybe you recall our Japanese lesson from last time. You should also know that V and B work just like R and L too. You might say that Joe is a V shonen. Anyway, for the most part, launching is just something you can do for fun, but as we'll see later, it has at least one major use. This is the first room, which requires you to understand the combo system in order to consistently get enough points for a V rank. It's tempting to look at Viewtiful Joe and see it as nothing more than a simple, well-constructed little side-scroller with no greater lessons to be gleaned, but the way scoring works is a fantastic template which could be applicable in many places. Firstly, one major improvement compared to Devil May Cry is that scoring is transparent. Apart from coins, every single time you score a point, a V appears on screen to let you know you did. If something scores no points, you know. If something scores more points than usual, you know. And of course, they're tallied at the top of the screen so you can see your running total. After a little experimentation, this allows you to understand the exact point value of every action, which in turn allows you to make better decisions. Secondly, the score is broken into two parts. For brevity and clarity, I'll use the terms multiplicand and multiplier. Don't worry about the scary maths words, the multiplicand is just the part of the score that's not the multiplier. This is a design pattern which appears in many shoot-em-ups, which may have acted as an inspiration, but the way it works in Joe is different to the most common types you'd see elsewhere. Normally the multiplier would go up the longer you manage to stay alive or by chaining kills within a short time frame, but here the multiplier acts almost like an entirely separate score, which is the key difference. Some actions increase the multiplicand and some actions increase the multiplier, but there's often little overlap between the two. Since the end result is the product of those two numbers, they're equally important, so spending all your energy on one is a bad idea. Generally, increasing the multiplicand is done by hitting a dizzy enemy, whereas increasing the multiplier is done by rock-on attacks. Since exiting slow-mo ends the current combo, that means you can't abuse slow-mo if you want a good score. Rock-on attacks deal more damage and push enemies away, making it hard to score more multiplicand points once you start using them. This is why you'll often see me dodging and attacking several enemies before going into slow-mo. The goal is to get the multiplicand as high as possible before transitioning into slow-mo and building up the multiplier. Dizzying ties into this system in an elegant way because it means that if you're up against basic enemies, it's often necessary to allow at least one of them to attack you so you can pull off a dodge. This curbs a problem which sometimes crops up in other action games where you find an optimal strategy or your skill increases to the point that you can annihilate basic enemies before they pose any kind of threat. Viewtiful Joe capitalizes on its movie premise by saying it's not a good film if the protagonist just plows through everything, so each fight scene needs to have at least one close call. Once you've built up some Vs, you shift into slow-mo and it's like a gear change, which is what I really like about this split scoring system. On top of trying to avoid attacks, you're pulled in two directions. Doing too much damage to enemies outside of slow-mo can be a bad idea since you risk killing them, but every second outside of slow-mo is more dangerous, so the question is, when are you going to use it, and how can you make the most of it once you do? There's even another subtlety which complicates decision making further depending on the layout of the room, but I'll talk about that later when it's on screen. For now, just notice how I'm forced to build up some points outside of slow-mo, which puts me in danger, keeping the combat fully engaging even though I've had plenty of practice. At this point I don't have any unlockable moves, so in order to get around faster during slow-mo, I'm cancelling my attacks to nudge Joe forward. Without this technique, you have to wait for the recovery animation to complete before Joe can walk again, which ends up being much slower, especially over short distances. Thankfully, once you buy a couple of moves, this is no longer the optimal way to get around because it's pretty clunky. It's a lot of button presses for little payoff. In Viewtiful Joe, punches cancel kicks and vice versa, but punches don't cancel punches and kicks don't cancel kicks. This feels so intuitive you might not even realize why it's set up this way, but the answer is so you can hammer a single button with impunity. If kicks cancelled kicks, then tapping that button would make Joe twitch back to the start of the animation, maybe never reaching the active frames. It would be awful to control, so most, if not all, action games follow this rule where an action can't cancel itself. It's just more obvious than usual in this one because much of the combat takes place in slow-mo, so it's easier to put under scrutiny. This is one reason why, despite its extreme difficulty in places, I think Viewtiful Joe makes a good entry point for those looking to delve deeper into the genre. Since jumps, kicks and punches all cancel each other under most circumstances, you could say Viewtiful Joe has low commitment. That means you're rarely locked into animations, so even if you make a misstep, it's possible to avoid damage by reacting in time. Slow dodging is the primary way of accomplishing this since it allows you to respond to most attacks the moment you see them coming. If there's one thing Viewtiful Joe does uniquely well, even 15 years later, it might be this. Slow dodge is like a catch-all safety net of game design because even if you end up in a dire situation, you can almost always slow dodge your way out of it. That makes it much easier for the designers to ensure fairness in just about every engagement, but players are still incentivized not to rely on it because it wastes a huge chunk of the VFX meter. Devil Trigger linked separate engagements together by a shared resource, but VFX does something different. It links your offensive and defensive capabilities together. Slow dodge is the easiest and safest method of avoiding damage, but it costs meter which could be spent on other abilities instead. This creates a nice sense of progress, where your offensive capability explicitly increases the better you get at defense, and even after you get a grip on combat, knowing that it all runs on one shared resource tempts you into making riskier decisions. For example, you might try to avoid using slow-mo by running under the helicopter while the gun is warming up. Do it fast enough and you'll avoid wasting VFX, but time it too late and you're taking damage instead. Those kinds of potential trade-offs are abundant, which complicates decision-making during every encounter. Even though Devil May Cry and Viewtiful Joe are different in many ways, they both stand to gain by including a shop system. To recap, it provides an incentive to chase good scores, acts as a soft tutorial for additional moves, and increases replay value. We know this, we know it works, until we find a better system there's no need to change it. Of course, that's not to say a shop is appropriate for every game, or even necessary for an action game to be great, but it's a tried and true method with many benefits. This room is a perfect example of the kind of gameplay ramifications a widescreen remaster would have. Viewtiful Joe, being a side-scroller, was designed around a strict, consistent amount of visibility at all times. Now, I'll be the first to admit I hate the barrels in this room. I think they're too big and move too fast considering the field of view. That's not to say they're unfair, they can be dodged every time if you know what you're doing, but they arrive frustratingly fast when you're not used to them. On my terms, I think the game would improve slightly if this room had a wider viewing angle, but it would be changed, there's no denying that. In a sense, it would be a somewhat different game than before. For anyone well experienced with them, a widescreen option would make the helicopter and jet bosses feel quite different. Again, not outright better or worse, but at least a little less challenging. I've raised this point already, so I won't dwell on it, but it's worth bearing in mind, particularly for a 2D game. Whereas Devil May Cry only had a single enemy type in each area, Viewtiful Joe is more like other action games since most encounters are built with multiple types of opponents. Verdes, the green flying guys, are glass cannons. Even just a few regular punches will kill them, but when left alone their missiles become highly threatening. Being able to distinguish which enemies pose the most danger is valuable. It introduces target prioritization as a strategic element of combat. Verdes are the most obvious, but not necessarily best example of that because it soon becomes apparent they should be the highest priority, at which point an efficient player can tackle them first every time. Now, you could argue there's some nuance to this, since Chromarties, the black elite guys, have to be dodged 4 consecutive times to be dizzied. Using a Verde instead makes it much easier to trigger rock-on, so it could be worth taking out a single Verde at a time. You can think of them as rock-on triggers as long as they're still alive. Personally, I found that wasn't worth it though, they caused too much hassle, so whenever they appear I focus them down, which is more or less the correct way to handle them. You might also notice that when rock-on becomes available, the player has to retaliate against a dizzy enemy before other targets open up. If it was more permissive, then Bianchis or Verdes could be exploited as a way of making other enemies vulnerable. You could leave one Bianchi alive, dodge a single attack from it, and use that rock-on to destroy the Chromarties, which are supposed to be much more difficult. Then, when you ran out of VFX, you'd be free to walk over to the Bianchi and do it all over again. Instead, you have to hit them first, and perhaps not coincidentally, a basic Bianchi or Verdi will die from a single slow-mo attack, preventing the player from using them more than once. This is a smart, elegant solution to a potential exploit which solves the problem but still preserves some of the strategy. You're free to fight the Bianchis first and use that to your advantage, you just can't rely on them forever. Captain Blue is my favourite character design in this game, and I think he exemplifies how Viewtiful Joe represents a different kind of coolness from Devil May Cry, which was more straightforward in that regard. Of course, Dante is stylish, but his appeal is pretty generic. Tough on the outside, soft on the inside, exceptionally skilled without trying too hard. Joe and Blue are very different, but before I explain that, a quick breakdown of Blue while he's on screen. His mustache serves a dual purpose because it was out of fashion by the time this game released, letting us know he has antiquated taste, but it's also the only thing which signifies his age. Without those visible grey hairs, you wouldn't know for sure he's in his 50s or 60s. The crack over the visor tells us he's the real deal, the antenna has only a single prong which sets Joe up as his successor, and the high collar on his cape is a little sinister which foreshadows his true role. In an interview, Kamiya himself admitted that Joe doesn't look cool. Unless you happen to have some very specific proclivities, your first impression of a bobble-headed insect-like spandex wearer isn't going to be adoration. I think Blue has a different aura though. He looks cool from the moment he appears, and the main difference, funnily enough, is his stomach. He's way out of shape for a superhero, well past his prime, but that implies he's been a hero long enough for it to become routine, and despite whatever his personal problems might be, he's still sticking with it. Perseverance is admirable. The story is simplistic, but I think if it's about anything, it's about passion rather than heroism, since Joe is comically disinterested in rescuing Sylvia, at least until the end. He's more a hero by accident than on purpose. I'll leave it for the philosophers among us to decide whether right intent is necessary to classify someone as a hero, but regardless, it's clear to see that passion is something Joe and Blue share in common. His idolization of Blue is probably why he wears a blue shirt when he's not transformed. The HMD on the front stands for His Master's Dance, an allusion to Joe following in Blue's footsteps. For players, rather than seeing and wanting to become Joe because he's so cool, it's something which unfolds a little more slowly. Joe is much more so an everyman than Dante, to the point where he can even be annoying in the beginning, but it's hard not to be won over by his earnestness in the end. He's unpretentious because he always seems to be having fun. In the end, the conclusion shows both the positives and negatives of passion as personified by Joe and Blue respectively, but being so straightforward, it doesn't have much to say about that theme. Instead, the point this story is better at exemplifying is how you can have the most boring or dorky hobby in the world, but as long as you're passionate about it, that's enough to make you cool. Or at least that's my take on it, and it's easy to see how game developers might be inclined to feel the same way. This is the first instance where you have to collect film reels by knocking enemies around. Some of them are too far away to reach by hand. In order to succeed, you need to know which direction enemies will be sent by your attacks. One of the most elegant aspects of combat is that punches will always send enemies orthogonally, whereas kicks go diagonally. This is always true whether you're on the ground or in the air, using an uppercut, red hot kick, zoomed in or out, it's always the difference between kicks and punches. It's a pattern, and patterns are good because humans seem primed to look for them wherever we can. As a result, they worm their way into your subconscious more quickly, which is where higher level play starts to happen. If my research is right, then scientists use the terms explicit and implicit memory to refer to that distinction. So instead of kicking a Bianchi randomly, after a while you start kicking them because you want to send them diagonally, and thanks to this simple pattern, players might not even consciously realize how they learned that. It's also convenient that the right trigger activates max speed, when the fast forward option on a conventional video player is a button on the right of two arrows pointing right, even in Japan. Likewise, the punch button is higher than the kick button on the controller, at least for the GameCube version. Anecdotal evidence, but I find the hardest part of going back to the PS2 version is how punches and kicks no longer have that high-low relationship on the controller. Those are the types of things where, when you get them right, nobody notices, but if you get them wrong, the character can feel strange somehow. Players can adapt to all sorts of arbitrary control schemes, but there's a lot of value in smoothing out that process as much as possible. One tiny quibble I have with the controls is that unless you alternate kicks and punches, Joe won't do a proper combo until his hits start connecting with a target. In other words, it's impossible to test what combos look like in a safe environment. Many older beat-em-ups used to work in a similar way, but there it served a purpose. The first attack of each combo was often a quick jab, so locking other moves behind that one acted like an automatic hit confirm, meaning your character took the safe option until an attack actually connected, then once the enemy was vulnerable, they launched into more elaborate, damaging moves which have dangerous recovery times. In Viewtiful Joe, there's no need to hit confirm anything, both because Joe's animations tend to be low commitment, and also because it's almost always clear beforehand whether an attack will connect or not. Anyway, the end result is you can't figure out your favourite attack combinations outside of combat, which is just a cosmetic preference, but that would have facilitated player expression a bit more. It's a very minor point, but it strikes me as one way Viewtiful Joe may have copied its predecessors without understanding the full benefits and drawbacks of doing so. Allowing Joe to launch into full combos against thin air would have no downside. The tutorial a few minutes ago all but forces you to light the Bianchi on fire, introducing that mechanic for now, but the pillars in the background are another not so subtle hint. Locking the player in a tiny room with no other options is a good way to make sure they don't give up, although it also means the solution is inevitable, which kind of defeats the purpose. An interesting difference between this shop and the last one is that, since Joe doesn't unlock any additional weapons, everything is purchasable from the start. It's even possible to buy max speed or zoom dependent techniques before you acquire those skills, although you'll only visit the shop 3 times before they're both unlocked anyway. Skill trees are better at getting the imagination racing, but when you think about it, a flat shop where anything can be bought from the beginning is more complex in a way. Objectively, it allows for the maximum number of combinations in which those abilities can be purchased, which counts for a lot. Just because something looks simple doesn't mean it is simple. As you'll see shortly, boomerangs can be very powerful in the right circumstances. Since they're capable of hitting multiple times as they pass through an enemy, using them in slow-mo does a lot of damage. There's a catch though, they score no points. This is a perfect example of why a ranking system can be so beneficial. Boomerangs have high damage potential, and they often act as an interrupt, stopping an enemy from following through with attacks. Without a ranking system, they'd be exploitable, but since they score nothing, their use is much more limited. I can't rely on them for this entire fight because if I did, I'd get a bad rank. The best way to think of it is like a second line of defense against abusable techniques. Ranking acts as a safeguard because it means it's not enough for a move to do too much damage or score too many points, it has to do both of those things to become a detriment. Ideally, every action would have reasonable pros and cons, but designers can't catch everything, something is bound to slip through the cracks. A ranking system means it now has to slip through 2 independent cracks instead, which is much less likely. I have enough points to buy the VFX turbocharger now, but instead of doing that I'm going to buy some less useful abilities first. As an additional constraint on this playthrough, I won't be getting the turbocharger until halfway through. I did this partly just to see if I could, which is in the spirit of a challenge run, but I also wanted to test an assumption I had. VFX turbocharger is without a doubt the most powerful upgrade, but it's still optional. Presumably, even on the highest difficulty, each encounter is balanced in such a way you can get perfect ranks even without it, which I can now say is true, at least for the first 3 episodes. Not having it does slow down the combat though, so I thought it'd be too self-indulgent to do the whole commentary without. I'm not sure I could, even if I wanted to anyway. The boss rush would have posed a serious problem. Inaba once said he playtests new builds without any upgrades enabled, then tries it again with them unlocked to see the difference. If he was doing that in the Viewtiful Joe days, then he might be the one responsible for ensuring it was still possible to get by. As for whether or not the upgrade should be balanced this way, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. If the turbocharger was required to get a high enough score or meet the time limit on some sections, that would punish players who don't get enough points to buy it early, which could be an interesting obstacle to overcome. On the other hand, leaving it as an optional purchase makes the combat a little less challenging overall, but players can still self-impose that additional challenge if they like. Talking about difficulty is always ironically difficult because it's one of the most subjective aspects of any game. Players have differing skill levels, and even over time a single person might improve or degrade substantially. While I think I could often walk away with a Rainbow V rank nowadays, I certainly couldn't have done it on my first playthrough. I think it's fine that the turbocharger exists as an optional purchase, but maybe if I practiced more I'd start to resent its inclusion. If I got better, I might feel as though it made the combat too easy, at which point I'd have to stop myself from purchasing it if I wanted to be challenged again. One reason I find Viewtiful Joe so enjoyable is that I find it to be a genuine struggle at times, even if I use everything at my disposal. It would be a shame if it didn't offer that kind of satisfaction, and maybe for someone more practiced, the turbocharger really would undermine the difficulty. Still, I've played this game enough to say that for the vast majority of people there's a more than acceptable level of challenge on offer, with or without every upgrade. This encounter highlights one of Viewtiful Joe's most unique features. The VFX meter resets to its default at the start of every stage. To begin with, this might seem like a strange or poor design choice. After all, we can be quite conceited. We like to see our power level go up, not down. But I think if you're able to get out of that mentality, it's a more than justified inclusion. This allows otherwise identical encounters to feel distinct from each other, and nowhere is that more obvious than this semi-secret gauntlet of armed Chromarties. These guys are some of the most challenging enemies available, which would normally be reserved for the end of a stage when your VFX meter is much larger. Fighting them with the bare essentials pushes Joe to the limit. I actually think this is a moment of poor balancing because while it might not look it, it's one of the hardest encounters in this playthrough. The difficulty won't ramp up this high again for at least a couple of episodes. It would be a bit easier with the turbocharger, but either way it's a noticeable spike. In the past I've talked a little bit about enemy variety, but a more robust way of thinking about this is encounter variety instead. If you can take the same enemy but change the situation enough, then fighting them can feel fresh again. Resetting the VFX meter goes some way towards accomplishing that by itself. Maybe not all the way, but considering what a simple idea it is just to reduce the character's power level from time to time, it really works wonders. The biggest problem is just that players haven't been conditioned to accept it because other games don't do it. If you're skeptical, I'd urge you to try at least one playthrough on Ultra V rated before making up your mind. This difference is definitely felt most clearly on the highest difficulty. There's only a handful of secret encounters in Viewtiful Joe, but while they're often less frustrating than their Devil May Cry counterparts, they're also less useful. They don't rely on exploiting specific mechanics, so they don't act as tutorials. That doesn't make them worthless or anything, but it's an area where encounters feel a little lacking. An arbitrary restriction to work around adds challenge and variety, something which could have been framed as the director's commands this time around. There's a lot of potential there if you think about it. Light 3 enemies on fire, finish an encounter without jumping, perform 3 different poses, complete the fight without using slow-mo, you get the idea. Even just a few spread over the course of a whole playthrough would boost the encounter variety considerably. During the next fight, I make a mistake which would have cost me my combo if I hadn't scored a critical dizzy on the first Chromartie. Although the chance to get a critical dizzy is 1 in 5 without any apparent pattern, it's actually decided by a straightforward algorithm which can be predicted. A non-quantum computer is incapable of just plucking a number out of thin air. Instead, random numbers are produced by taking a few other variables and running them through a generator, usually with a sick name like Mersenne Twister or Zor Shift, which jumbles the result. In what might be an attempt to optimize, Viewtiful Joe uses a much more simplistic algorithm instead. A count increases by 1 every time you dizzy an opponent, by 2 every time you kill something, and by 3 every time you land an attack which scores points. That sum is then run through a modulo 5 operation, so if the number is evenly divisible by 5, you get a crit. This is what leads me to conclude critical dizzies are supposed to be random, but it's a borderline case where once you know all the variables at play, it can be exploited, even just by an average Joe. For example, if you're facing a row of Bianchis and happen to crit against the first one, punching it 3 times then dodging the next one will guarantee a crit. As for how useful this is, it isn't. No matter how many hours it might have taken to reverse engineer, critical dizzies are almost meaningless if you play well, so it's better to just accept the randomness and focus on scoring instead. Blue and Alistair both share the rival role, but even so it's surprising that the Blue encounters are all front-loaded as tutorial engagements. It makes his appearance as a villain more unexpected, but it also means all major skills are unlocked only a fraction of the way through. Some action games wait quite a while to introduce important weapons or skills, which can be satisfying in its own way, but that's a decision which should be tailored to each game. Viewtiful Joe isn't a one-shot affair, you're expected to replay it over and over as you chase ranks and push the difficulty level higher. Therefore, it makes sense that repeat playthroughs would be a higher priority than first impressions. Delaying the zoom unlock until much later would make for an impactful surprise, but it could harm repeat playthroughs by making players feel too limited. This approach of introducing everything by the second episode allows for some challenges to be built around a more limited skill set, but still unlocks everything early enough that you don't spend time pining for stuff you know you'll get later. It's well paced, and I think that's something which could be said about this game in general. You might have noticed by now that there's almost no downtime at all, about the only exception are these little tutorial bits, and this happens to be the last one of those. There's several reasons why the pacing is so tight. First of all, skipping cutscenes is as instant as it gets. Secondly, there's seldom more than an empty screen's worth of distance separating 2 encounters. Thirdly, even when there is a larger distance, it can be traversed much more quickly thanks to the existence of max speed, which enables you to move so fast it can be difficult to execute even simple jumps. Fourthly, areas with fewer enemies often have film reels to collect or environmental hazards to avoid. And finally, there's a few puzzles to solve along the way. The sewer I'm about to enter is a good example of all of this. Puzzles are distinct from the rest of the challenges I listed because everything else is a test of skill, whereas a good puzzle is a test of intelligence. That said, the puzzles in Viewtiful Joe aren't actually good intelligence tests because the V-Watch is lacking a consistent logic in how it interacts with the world. Earlier I used max speed to get over some sewage, whereas here it affects the sewage itself. You never know what it's going to do until you use it, so I'm not sure these moments qualify as puzzles at all. That said, they're still worthwhile because they're almost always integrated with platforming challenges, which again might be an example of prioritizing repeat playthroughs over first impressions. So when you're not beating stuff up, you're using your powers, jumping over gaps, dodging lasers, or otherwise pressing forward in a way which still tests your skill, even if it's just how well you can handle moving at max speed. All of this is to say that if you skip cutscenes, Viewtiful Joe is exceptionally thin on downtime. It's fair to consider that a huge point in its favour, and it deserves respect for focusing so hard on the aspects it excels at, but I don't think it's as simple as saying that the ideal action game is 100% action. This might be a case where intuition and logic are at odds with one another. Sometimes it's worth worrying about the former more than the latter. If we want to arrive at a logically perfect design, then of course an action game should be all action, but we're only human, so performing a repetitive task often causes us to become increasingly careless. Psychologists call that vigilance decrement, which apparently begins to take effect after just 15 minutes. One way of combating that problem is to give players a breather by asking them to do something else for a moment instead. If you let the cutscenes play out, you get plenty of breaks, but that seems less than ideal since they're non-interactive and take up a fixed length of time. There's something inherently strange about crafting a game designed for replayability while also cramming it with cutscenes players are going to skip most of the time. Anyway, whether cutscenes are a valid answer to that problem or not, all I know for sure is if I skip them, Viewtiful Joe becomes one of the most tiring action games I've played. It's 3 hours of non-stop, meticulous, fast-paced combat. Most of the time I find that other action games have the opposite problem, where there's too much enforced downtime by puzzles, unskippable cutscenes, long stretches of menu use or something similar. So I appreciate that Viewtiful Joe is the other way around, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't actually need to take a break sometimes when it says break time. Bats are one of the most annoying enemies since they latch onto Joe, leading to a frustrating period of vulnerability while Joe shakes them off. They also work in a kind of old school way where their tell is a lack of a tell. By which I mean, instead of playing some animation before attacking, they just freeze in place then dive bomb. That was something you saw more frequently in older games where animation was more limited. Sometimes an enemy standing still was all the warning you'd get before they launched an attack. It works, but thankfully it's not a common way of presenting danger in Viewtiful Joe. When you know what to look for, it's pretty easy to see, but they can be an aggravating enemy to deal with on a first playthrough. Despite that, they're a valuable inclusion because they fill the target prioritization role better than Verdi's. Since bats get replenished as a fight continues, it forces players to make a choice about whether they're going to spend time focusing them down or deal with everything else instead. Even in a worst case scenario where a player sticks to the same strategy every playthrough, bats give those other enemies more opportunities to attack, as you saw at the start of this engagement. My focus was clearing out the bats, but I had to take care not to get shot while doing so. At the same time, even though a combination of bats and ranged attackers is quite dangerous, it gives players an immediate goal to accomplish. When you put it that way, it's no surprise that mixing enemy types is one of the most commonly recurring ways of building encounters because it increases challenge but also feels empowering from the player's perspective. It gives you the opportunity to form a plan and see that plan come to fruition piece by piece as you pick off your chosen targets. Visually, I think this stage has a nice sense of progression to it. You start off in a residential area, head into the murky green sewers for a while, then emerge back into a downtown section which has tons of distinct textures plastered all over the place. There's even a whole Chinatown segment with its own assets, including a unique backing instrument on the soundtrack which ends up mostly getting skipped over. Each area only lasts a few minutes, and the contrast between them provides a nice sense of progression. There's a temptation to think that because it works so well here, every stage should follow a similar 3-act structure, but over the course of a full playthrough that would get repetitive and boring. Ironically, I think part of pacing a full game well is not to pace every individual part equally well. The next stage is an extended climb up through a hotel, but that's fine because the one afterwards is a short shoot 'em up. Anyway, a lot of this style is carried by texture work. You can see shadows are just painted in directly as darker segments. Joe himself is a Sentai hero, but the deeper, thicker shadows are something more associated with Western comics. One notable exception is JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, which also has a lot of extreme shading. There's a locker in Resident Evil 2 with the name JoJo on it, and we know Kamiya is a fan, so that might have something to do with how Joe got his name. Whatever the inspiration, the art style does a lot to tie the two main concepts together. As a result, it's not too weird to see this Japanese-style superhero tearing his way through Hollywood-style set pieces. If you scrutinize the backgrounds, it's pretty easy to tell that a lot of environmental objects are just sprites, but since this is ostensibly a film set, it's easy to imagine they're cardboard cutouts. This might also explain why some enemies just wait around for their buddies to get beat up. It's not as though it's important for Viewtiful Joe to make sense or anything. It'd still be a great game even if the story and setting was incomprehensible. That said, having a premise which provides a plausible explanation for some of its shortcomings is still a point in its favour. While background textures appear to be lit by an ambient value, character models are cel-shaded at runtime since they are dynamic. Viewtiful Joe is one of the earliest titles to use the technique, coming just a few years after Jet Set Radio, which seems to be the first real-time example. In case you're not sure what I'm talking about, cel shading is a technique whereby the light and dark areas of a model are broken into distinct blocks of colour so that the transition between them is more noticeable. As a result, it ends up looking more like a hand-drawn illustration. Viewtiful Joe seems to use a 4-tier system where a surface can either be lit, partially lit, unlit, or highlighted. Cel shading ensures only one of those 4 colours are the end result at any given point. If you watch Joe's head, you'll see the right side is red with a thin band of maroon in the middle, the left is black, and the leftmost edge white. That thin white highlight could be described as rim light, although in this case, since it only appears on the shaded side, I think it might be more accurate to consider it an exaggerated type of bounce light. Whatever you want to call it, highlighting those shaded areas gives an object clearer definition. Since it's an exaggerated pure white, it also adds a sort of gravitas which makes everything look heroic. I can't say with certainty how this effect was achieved, but if you pay close attention when multiple characters are on screen, you'll notice 2 curious properties. Every character is lit as though the source of light is directly to the right of them, and characters are incapable of casting shadows on each other. Both of these facts point to a simple implementation where the final colour of each point is decided just by which direction it's facing. Since the environments also seem to just have ambient lighting, there may not be any point light sources at all in this game. One thing films and games have in common is they often prioritise looking good over reflecting reality. It's said that cartoony art styles age better than realistic ones, but obviously games don't age at all. They're the same as they were at release, only the environment around them changes. What we're really referring to is a weird cognitive bias that occurs with cutting-edge graphics where they seem close to reality simply because we haven't seen a better imitation yet. Once that bar gets raised, you're left questioning how you ever thought it looked convincing in the first place. If you're young enough not to have been through that process, don't worry, it'll happen. Sooner or later, some sort of computational limit will be reached, at which point it might be prudent to return to a realistic and even pre-rendered style, much like Resident Evil. Until then, stylized graphics will always have a long-term edge over realistic ones since they don't compete with future hardware to the same extent. Viewtiful Joe may not have the best resolution, but it still looks like a comic book, which is all it needed to succeed. Realistic games suffer from a sense that if they were made later, they'd look unrecognizable, but Viewtiful Joe would probably look pretty similar. There'd be more pixels, the textures would be higher fidelity, but overall its style makes it complete and finished in a way that many of its contemporaries clearly aren't anymore. Incidentally, the genre being parodied here is called tokusatsu, which means special filming, as in a film with a lot of special effects. Viewtiful Joe also seems to be holding up better than its tokusatsu inspirations, although there can be something charming about low-budget special effects combined with live action. A minute ago I collected 40 bombs and boomerangs underneath the bus, which is a huge amount to find in one place. It's unusual enough for any box to contain those collectibles, let alone 4 of them clumped together. They're not even well hidden, although you do have to unlock sliding in order to grab them. Finding some useful items is fun, particularly if you missed them your first time around, but this almost invalidates them as consumables. To put it in perspective, these boomerangs alone will be enough to carry me to episode 7, and I use less than 40 bombs across the entire playthrough. Not only that, but I'll have 99 of each before I even throw another boomerang, which is more than a full episode from now. At this point I never have to worry about ammo, so it might make more sense for these to be unlockable abilities like any other. Flashing out the shop with a couple more expensive purchases seems like a better alternative than packing a few boxes with pickups, especially since film reels already fill that role pretty well. If you're an astute viewer, you might have noticed I didn't say this would be a no damage playthrough, I said it would be a Rainbow V rank playthrough. There's a difference. Ōkami allows you to recover from damage and still walk away with the best rank. It's a powerful technique, which may not seem to be in keeping with the game's challenging nature, but some important downsides keep it in check. Damage increases on higher difficulties, but Ōkami only ever heals 1 point, meaning you still lose health overall. On Ultra V rated, you'll likely die after the same number of hits either way. It also can't be used on an attack which would kill you since Joe dies before he hits the ground, meaning it's not possible to survive forever by abusing it. On top of that, it even removes the no damage bonus from results, which is separate from ranking. At the end of this encounter, the bonus is missing, which is worth 500 Viewtifuls in this episode. Quite a lot to be losing out on, that's more than the highest rank itself is worth. Basically, Ōkami isn't as powerful as it first appears, and even if there were no downsides, it's something players would probably want to avoid using anyway, since the only thing cooler than bouncing back from an attack is never getting hit in the first place. As long as it's not open to abuse, it's not a harmful inclusion. Anyway, here it is in action. If you find it frustrating to see me using it, then maybe it's the excuse you need to do your own no damage playthrough. The blue and red gem statues in this hall seem like a sly homage to Resident Evil. I think every creator has a natural temptation to honour their inspirations and past works through little callbacks, but sometimes it can be quite tacky, something Viewtiful Joe manages to avoid by not calling too much attention to them. Chances are, if you never played Resident Evil, nothing about this room seems strange to you, it's just an obstacle like any other. Same goes for Alistair, if you don't know who he is, you don't feel like you're being left out. Only when you discover the callback do you understand it even was one in the first place. That makes it inclusionary rather than exclusionary. The elevators in this stage might be another of those little nods. Beat 'em ups and elevators have a long and storied history. Now that we're in enclosed spaces, it's time to start using the alternate scoring technique more often. A rock-on attack which knocks one enemy into another will score 1 point, but that reward increases exponentially the more enemies get involved in the collision. In other words, the first one is worth 1, then 2, then 4, and so on. Since this ramps up so fast, it's a great way of increasing the multiplicand, the downside being that it knocks them away, making it harder to score more rock-on attacks. When you're in an enclosed space, that becomes less of a problem though, since they're just going to hit a wall on the other side of the room anyway. You can still close that distance and increase the multiplier before time runs out. This nuance is important because it means that not only is the scoring system forcing you to prioritize between multiplicand or multiplier, but the ideal way to balance those two numbers also changes depending on the situation. Once again, I'd like to point out it's possible to discover this intricacy thanks to the running tally at the top of the screen. All it takes is a few minutes of experimentation and careful observation. There's always the question of how much information should be disclosed to players versus how much should be left for them to discover. For example, you're never outright told to combine Ōkami with slow-mo, which makes it much easier to execute. Most older games just had a list of controls in the manual and maybe a couple of tips. Here's one from the Viewtiful Joe booklet. Quote, V points too hard to get? The trick is to let the enemy attack you first, then dodge, then counter with continuous pummeling punches and kicks. Viewtiful Joe will gain his points. End quote. If you were lucky, the attract mode video might demonstrate an advanced technique as well. I'll admit that's how I learned the best way to fight Nero Angelo. Any action game can be broken into 2 phases. I'll call them the discovery phase and the mastery phase. Hopefully self-explanatory. Ideally, a game should be enjoyable at both points. For whatever reason, some players may not enjoy the discovery portion, and a naive approach might say that we could craft a game for those people just by telling them all the mechanics up front, but that's not practical. First of all, even if you put an awkward disclaimer in the tutorial saying that there were no more techniques to find, players can't be sure whether that's a lie, and even if it's not, there could be something the developers or even the entire player base aren't aware of. So if you want to master any game, you need to do some exploration. This is why I think it's fair to say that even action games have a strong problem-solving element to them. In order to excel, you need to know what your abilities are and how they can be combined. If you've never quite understood or appreciated the appeal of this genre, it might help you to think of them a bit like puzzle games. Finding out what is and isn't possible in a deep action game can be just as enjoyable as the best puzzlers, and even for similar reasons. Both are built around rule sets which behave in a consistent, predictable manner, allowing players to combine actions in clever ways. Maybe my hyper-expert play makes this difficult to believe, but I'll admit there's things I still don't know. One detail which makes me suspicious is that completing an attack string seems to hold no benefits even though it has a unique visual signifier. During slow-mo, every attack has a pink streak, but at normal speed that streak only appears at the end of a string. Unless you pay very close attention it's difficult to notice, but it's there. If you alternate between punches and kicks 8 times, it happens on the last punch and kick in the sequence. Otherwise it happens on the 4th punch or 4th kick in a row. Curiously, it seems to have no effect. It doesn't score any more points, and if it does more damage, it's not enough to be easily discernible. Perhaps at some point in development it was more than just a visual flourish. For example, maybe those final hits were necessary to trigger Rock-On. Whatever the reason, you could see it as an early precursor to Wicked Weaves from Bayonetta. In this case it's just cosmetic, but the concept of the final punch or kick being imbued with a special property is identical. As for other unknowns, you'll see some clever uses for the shocking pink bomb throughout the rest of this video, but I've never found a good opportunity to integrate it into actual combat, so there might be some aspect of it I've overlooked. I just lit a few enemies on fire, and honestly, I'm not sure what the point is. Having done it to the first boss, I could tell by his health bar that it does a small amount of tick damage, but not enough to be worthwhile, and it doesn't seem to cause any other effects. If anything, it's slightly disadvantageous because it reduces an enemy's health pool without scoring points, effectively costing points you could have scored with that health instead. Despite that, it would be a fun self-imposed challenge to see how long you could keep the fire buff active, except continually attacking doesn't reset the timer on it the way you might expect. It wears off after a fixed period regardless of how aggressive you are. Considering the game's title was Red Hot Man at one point, you could be forgiven for thinking fire would have a larger role. Probably for the best they went with a different title in the end though. These kinds of things where there's a visual effect without much use behind it is worrying for a humble commentary producer because it leaves you with the sense that you've overlooked something. Having done plenty of experimentation, I have no choice but to throw my hands up in the air at a few unanswered questions. There might be more to say about them, or there might not. If you're feeling intrepid, you can take those mysteries as your homework. Stage hazards are another way of building encounter variety, which this chapter demonstrates well because it would otherwise just be a series of hotel rooms. Throwing in some environmental obstacles adds a secondary concern for players to be wary of as they deal with each encounter. Keep that in mind going forward, not just in this stage, but for the rest of the playthrough. If you pay attention to the layout of each encounter, you'll notice how little redundancy there is, even though enemy types themselves repeat quite often. You'll see barrels, lasers, bombs, conveyor belts, mines, missiles, and poison gas as we advance. It might also be fair to consider some simplistic enemy types more as hazards than actual opponents, like the bats which have appeared a few times by now, or the little mole things that are found on this floor. You might have a hard time noticing them, but they're quite aggravating to deal with, which might be why they only show up in a couple of places. There's no audio cue to accompany them, and since they come from the floor, they can be obscured by foreground decorative sprites or other threats. Dispatching them doesn't feel great either since they just get knocked away with one hit. Frankly, I think the game would improve if they were cut outright. Since they only appear a few times, they're not a huge detriment or anything, but they don't improve the experience either. A reluctance to cut seems to be one of the biggest issues plaguing games in general, which is understandable when you consider how much work they take to make. Implementing even that simple mole would have taken some time, and the sunk cost fallacy can be strong. From experience I can say it's sometimes hard to cut a paragraph of text from a script, let alone an entire day, week or month's worth of effort. Unfortunately, there also seems to be this perception among consumers that any kind of cut feature or content is always a bad thing, which makes a game incomplete. Sometimes that's true, but sometimes the simplest and best path to improvement is just discarding what doesn't work. Apparently, one piece of advice handed down from Mikami to Kamiya was to focus on improving the best aspects of a game rather than try to fix every little problem. It seems as though that lesson stuck, but it's important to remember refinements can be made from both ends. Throw in a bunch of cheap, simple improvements and they start to add up. One such visual touch is the little sprites bolted onto the foreground in front of doors. Since the camera is set up to swing quickly from room to room, that little sprite ends up looking like a swish effect, but it's actually there at all times. Whenever I'm not in slow-mo, just look to the very left or right of the screen here. You can see some black streaks creeping into the periphery. I wondered whether I should point that out or not. Analysing a game sometimes feels like explaining a magic trick. The magician is just trying to entertain everyone, whereas the guy who reveals the inner workings is the one who ruins the fun. You can't help but feel like you lose something in that learning process, but sometimes you gain a new appreciation too. I still enjoy seeing that little sprite, just now I know how the magic was done. Jelbies, the big yellow guys, will be popping up pretty frequently from now on. They seem to be the only enemy which were tweaked for the higher difficulties. Their animations run about double the speed they do on adults. Personally, I would have preferred if they had just been made more aggressive, since the worst thing about them is you're sometimes left with nothing to do but wait for them to attack. I've tried a lot of different methods to get around that and none have been successful. You would think you'd at least be able to bait them into a fight by punching them, but they don't seem to react, so occasionally you'll just have to bide your time. This is a funny complaint because Viewtiful Joe's scoring system requires players to dodge attacks anyway, but it's frustrating when you know your only possible option is to stand around. Slow, zoomed punches are the ideal way to kill those guys, but if you just hold the attack button, they get pushed too far away to kill in a single cycle, which is why I take those little pauses in between to nudge Joe forward one step. Zooming in and out isn't necessary, but it's useful to assess your surroundings and adds a little more flair to something which is unfortunately repetitive. Another method of killing them is to use uppercuts. For whatever reason, if you hold the punch button, a zoomed uppercut which lands on an opponent will automatically cancel into another one. That might be the easiest way to kill them, but it's less VFX efficient since the uppercut does less damage than a regular punch. Jokers also go down easily to some zoomed punches, as you saw. Their speed can make them aggravating to deal with if you don't know the ideal method, so I can't say I'm disappointed they become trivial to dispatch, but it's not ideal that they don't even get a chance to fight back if you know what you're doing. They may as well not exist once you figure out the right strategy. Anyway, I don't have much to say about them, so instead I'd like to point out that this room introduces lasers on the higher difficulties. The concept of encounter variety might even be demonstrated best of all by the slot machines. On lower difficulties, this one is just a repeat of the first, but thanks to those strategically positioned lasers, every slot machine on Ultra V-rated has a unique gimmick to it. Games are repetitive by their very nature, but that's not an excuse for just repeating the exact same thing. The slot machines are a perfect example of reusing content while also keeping it fresh enough not to feel monotonous. We're coming up on Hulk Davidson now, so here's a bit of trivia about him. On the back of his jacket there's a kanji character which means katamari, a lump or a clod. Obviously that's because he's a bit of a hulking mass, but there's a little more to it than that. If you remove the leftmost component, katamari becomes oni, a demon. My Japanese is pretty lacking, but I think it's what you'd consider the kanji equivalent of a pun, or maybe a misspelling. I'll let this cutscene play out so you can get a feel for the audio mixing.
Yo, man. What's up? What can I do for you, kiddo? I guess you heard I rule the roost around here. Am I right? Huh?
Oh man, don't flatter yourself. You're just another one of those old attractions in this movie land.
What? Wait a minute, Jet.
Even with such extreme distortion on his voice, Hulk is still easier to understand than Charles or Bruce, who are borderline incomprehensible if you're not wearing headphones. Much like Devil May Cry, this would have been a non-issue for Japanese players since it had English audio with Japanese subtitles. Hulk is about to ask Joe if he's some kind of Mega Man or something, but Mega Man is called Rockman in Japan, so they recorded an alternate version of that line for this scene. To me, the appeal of that joke is how Hulk probably isn't referencing Mega Man specifically. The phrase Mega Man is generic enough, he might have just made it up on the spot. It being a reference, but not really, is a little wink at the audience who can't help but think of the Mega Man when we hear those words together. By contrast, Rockman is so specific it spoils the ambiguity, a rare example of a joke being worse in the developer's native language. During this boss fight I'll be demonstrating Viewtiful Forever, which is the closest thing this game has to a taunt. It depletes the entire VFX gauge for 50 points, which is almost never worth it. I'm of two minds about this because conventional wisdom says that every action should have some sort of utility. As you'll see later, those 50 points can be worth grabbing against Metal Leos, but that's not enough to justify its inclusion, at least mechanically. On the other hand, maybe its uselessness is exactly what makes it worthwhile as a form of player expression. It's kind of cool to take an unnecessary risk just to look a little flashier. If nothing else, it fits with Joe's characterization. That's an argument which is worth considering, but it could be used to justify the inclusion of anything, so that's not a strong point in its favour. Regardless, it's fantastic that players have some amount of control over which pose Joe does. It depends on the amount of VFX segments remaining, which is how I'm going through them in descending order right now. Even if the move itself accomplishes nothing, that nuance to it is a brilliant little touch, which I think demonstrates the kind of consideration that went into every element. The simplest thing would have been to just make the pose random, but this way players can do whichever one they prefer by timing it correctly. Apparently the bosses being animals is an homage to tokusatsu shows like Kamen Rider, but it works out well because it improves a player's perceived affordance. I realise that might sound like gibberish, but it's not. Affordance, in its original definition, is what we might call the possibility space, the sum of all possible interactions between a person and an object, environment, or, in this case, game. Perceived affordance is how much of that we understand just from our senses. One commonly cited example is a teapot. Just seeing its shape foreshadows the idea of liquid pouring from it. It's impossible to know Davidson's full moveset from the moment he appears, but him being modelled as a rhino at least acts as a warning that he's likely to charge forward at some point. For this reason, we might say his visuals have good conveyance. To put all this more simply, big animal with horn, me know he charge now. It might be that they decided which animals to use and then came up with attacks to match those creatures, but that's irrelevant. It's good conveyance either way. Although it is worth pointing out that conveyance is partly based on a player's prior knowledge. If you're passionate about preserving games, then maybe you should also support conservation efforts as well. After all, future generations will have a harder time grasping this boss fight if rhinos go extinct. Conveyance is a fascinating topic for games because while many of them have visual elements which are similar to real life, the rules of interaction are sometimes quite abstract or different from reality. This means that the clarity of an element can vary depending on how many games a person has played, as certain tropes take on a life of their own or morph over time. Experienced players will see a cheeseburger and assume it restores health, when its real-world equivalent arguably does the opposite. There's room for games which are deliberately alien or subversive with how they choose to present themselves, but as a general guideline, some conveyance is better than no conveyance. At the very least, it's more helpful. Even if you're replaying this game regularly, it's easier to recall Davidson's attack patterns with the horn and giant axe acting as visual reminders.
Ready, Six Machine? Let's ride!
Well, it's already time for the customary genre shift. Fortunately, this one is well constructed. Movement has the kind of digital feel you'd find in full-fledged shoot-em-ups. All the buttons do what you'd expect based on their function during regular combat. It has some nice enemy variety, and it doesn't overstay its welcome. I sympathise with anyone who hates this kind of divergence, but I think it's worthwhile to see the VFX powers explored in a different context. One of the main arguments against these moments is that they consume resources which could be spent on the core gameplay instead. True, that's a concern worth raising, but perhaps thinking too logically since games aren't built by robots. 2 years of production may be short compared to some AAA dev cycles, but it's still a long period of time to be working on a single project. It's possible that some staff members found working on another mode to be a much needed relief. It could act as a way for the team to lift their spirits, and maybe it also helps with idea generation as well. I'm just speculating here, but it's possible the spin kick was conceived as part of this mode to deal with projectiles, then added to the main game afterwards. Even if that's not true, maybe this was still worth doing regardless, just to see what might come from it. Anyway, I like a good shoot 'em up as much as the next guy, but I prefer action games, and the main reason comes down to memorization. In order to get all the film reels here, I have to kill almost every enemy, which is practically impossible when you don't know where they'll spawn. Of course, when you replay combat sequences, you know what enemies will appear in each room, which buys you some kind of advantage, but they have a certain amount of unpredictability thanks to their AI. You'll have to react depending on what attacks they throw and how they move. The same isn't really true for shoot-em-ups, at least not this one. In this case, Verdes are the only ones that can vary their behaviour, and it's possible to kill them so fast that doesn't really matter. Anyway, the general differences between these two genres highlight what a specific niche Devil May Cry and Viewtiful Joe fall into. They have scoring systems, but they're not good score attack games, by which I mean aiming for high scores isn't the goal the way it might be in a shoot-em-up. Shmups tend to place an emphasis on high scores, and since they often have deterministic systems, they make for a good competitive battleground because they give each player identical footing to stand on. From there, the only thing that can explain why one person gets a higher score than another is a difference in skill or knowledge. Action games tend to have random AI, so high scores between two evenly matched players would end up being determined by luck at best or exploits at worst. Scoring is important, but more for the constraints and additional challenge imposed by trying to attain the best rank. Viewtiful Joe doesn't even bother to tell you an exact number at the end of each stage, only the ranks themselves, because that's the important part. Memorization isn't inherently bad. There can be something innately satisfying about it. The electronic game called Simon, where you have to press coloured lights in a certain order, even appears in various forms in computer games. You'll see a type of memorization challenge in the next episode of this very game, but it's important to point out that the pattern does change between different attempts at Simon. Here, the pattern will always be the same, so once it's learned, all that's left is execution. Execution can also be innately satisfying, by which I mean it taps into something humans find enjoyable. We like exercising our intelligence and dexterity in certain ways, possibly because doing so imparted some kind of evolutionary advantage. There's an argument to be made that memorization can be used to create tighter execution challenges than would be possible otherwise, since players don't have to react to stimuli, which comes with an unavoidable delay. But while that might be true, it's also true that the memorization part of the challenge disappears once you've figured out the optimal path. Earlier I talked about the problem-solving layer of action games, and while that layer might be stronger in the beginning as you learn what is or isn't possible, it never goes away because you'll always be placed into little variations on each situation which force you to reassess. Now, to be fair, achieving a level of mastery where you never have to react can be borderline impossible depending on the shmup, but if it's deterministic, the goal is to bring the number of those incidents down to 0. It's not that there's anything wrong with either style of game, but I think there's a stronger case to be made for a challenge which tests your execution and decision-making skills simultaneously. Not just because it's working on two different layers instead of one, but also because there's something that happens when you combine those layers. The best way I can phrase it is applied knowledge. Both your understanding and physical mastery are tested in unison. Rather than getting this one big payoff when you achieve perfect knowledge or perfect mastery of the mechanics, you get a constant feedback loop of success as you apply your knowledge. As if all the memorization of the last stage wasn't cruel enough, we get another dose of it here, but at least it helps me demonstrate how versatile Joe's aerial movement can be. Double jump, red hot kick, regular attacks, zoom, and even max speed all offer different ways of controlling Joe's descent. There's a simplistic but responsive feel to all of those options. The jump in particular may have taken some inspiration from Mega Man because it rises until the exact instant you let go of the button, at which point it immediately reverses direction. Since the player's input has an immediate effect on Joe's movement, it's lacking the sense of inertia which might make it an exceptional platformer, but it's pleasant just to move around, which is more than can be said for some dedicated platforming games. This room highlights the perils of thinking in terms of encounter variety. It's the only flat, submerged room in the entire game. All the others are sloped. This is probably why you fight such a large wave of enemies here, because it's technically not something that can be repeated anywhere else. In strictly logical terms, all of these encounters are non-redundant, but that doesn't mean they actually feel that way to the player. The low gravity underwater effect isn't that impactful since Joe's jump height is under perfect control either way. Even a very slight variation in terrain could be considered encounter variety, but players don't experience games as beings of pure logic. No matter how thoroughly we might be able to rationalize certain concepts, everything comes down to the player's experience when it's all said and done. This room isn't terrible by any means, but it could have been broken up a bit more by placing another flat section at the end of the slanted gauntlet we're about to go through. As we saw earlier, it's possible to move along the ground more quickly by sliding or cancelling each attack to nudge Joe forward, but neither of those are ideal because you're still locked into those animations. If you want to get Joe walking again, you'll have to let the recovery play out, which can take a long time during slow-mo. Red Hot Kick makes it possible to smooth that out. Most of Joe's animations can be cancelled by jumping, but jumping in slow-mo makes Joe airborne for much longer than you might want. Instead of letting the jump play out, it's possible to perform a red hot kick which moves at a diagonal back to the ground, and since red hot kick has no landing recovery, it's then possible to begin walking the moment it completes. If this explanation is hard to follow, just pay attention to how I sometimes jump and red hot kick back to the ground. That allows me to start walking again without having to wait for any animations to complete. It's possible to move at about the same speed by alternating between slides and uppercuts, but kick landing is more flexible since you regain access to your entire moveset, and on a more subjective note, it looks better too. Red Hot Kick is already a great move, so this hidden use for it makes it arguably the best technique. Perhaps the developers felt the same way because it also has a unique balancing measure not found on other skills. If you land 2 red hot kicks before touching the ground, you're locked into an uncancelable backflip animation which leaves Joe vulnerable. The zoomed spinning version of red hot kick also can't be cancelled by any means, so when you use it, you better be certain it's safe to do so. In spite of those downsides, red hot kick remains a powerful skill, but those quirks can backfire if you're not careful. Going forward, you'll see me making use of kick landings more often, which means I'll be spending more time fast walking by holding both the max speed and slow-mo buttons down. It makes perfect sense that Joe would be more restrictive in slow-mo at the beginning. There's nothing wrong with having the faster walk speed unlock a little later, but I'm confused and disappointed about the fact that you need to hold both buttons to fast walk. This feature was added late in development, which might explain a hasty implementation, and to be fair, it's a nice little eureka moment the first time you discover it. At some point, it's only natural to ask yourself what happens if you try using both at the same time. The answer is a nice reward. After that point though, there's no benefit to making players hold 2 buttons. There's no strategic advantage to be gained by walking more slowly, it's just objectively the poorer option of the two. As I said, pure execution challenges can be enjoyable, but I don't think it's the case that more execution is always better. I've already covered this topic with dodge cancelling in Devil May Cry, but I'd like to state it again in different terms to really drive it home, so let me put it this way. I'm of the belief that one day controllers as we know them will be a thing of the past. Brain-computer interfaces are already a point of research, and there's too many benefits at stake for it to remain an unfulfilled goal. If it's possible, it'll happen sooner or later. Controllers aren't just tools, they're also barriers, and once that barrier lifts, games which built too much of their difficulty from the control scheme will be pointless to play because everyone will be able to execute advanced techniques flawlessly. Maybe it seems excessive to worry about the future when we have no idea how long it'll take for such technology to become commonplace, but this thought experiment exposes an underlying truth which is relevant even now. Gameplay doesn't really happen on the controller, it happens in your mind. What matters are which decisions are possible and which ones you choose to make. The method of input is practically irrelevant. If you've attained mastery over some game, you know this already. When you're focused and fully engaged in a game you know well, the controller has a way of disappearing from your consciousness. All that's left is you and the events on screen. We might call that a flow state or immersion or something else, but whatever it is, it's the goal of just about every game. Therefore, reducing redundant inputs isn't some concession to casualization, it's actually a way of ensuring that a game's depth and difficulty is coming from the right place. Fast walking is trivial to execute, but it still fails that test. To be clear, I'm not advocating for lower skill ceilings, just that the skill ceiling should arise from genuinely meaningful actions. At its most fundamental level, a game is just a series of possible states. Therefore, game design is deciding which of those states are or aren't possible, regardless of the control scheme. One thing I never mentioned back in Devil May Cry is that holding the attack button with Ifrit just continues to do the entire combo. In other words, you can perform a full 4-hit combo just by holding the attack button once. By keeping the button held, you're essentially expressing your desire to continue attacking, so it's fine for the game to interpret it that way. The same thing works if you use round trip with Alistair. Keep the button held and Dante not only throws out the sword, but he also does an unarmed combo as well. Likewise with Joe, you're not expected to mash the button when you're in max speed or zoomed in, holding it will suffice. Now, there's an argument to be made that each distinct action should be a separate button press regardless. Pressing a button, which triggers a corresponding action on screen, is so enjoyable it's what hooked many of us about games when we were kids, but it's not necessary. As long as we're still reliant on physical controllers, it seems the ideal situation is to make sure holding and pressing the button results in 2 different actions. That way, there's an airtight excuse for making players press every time. Devil May Cry and Viewtiful Joe aren't quite there, but they're not the last action games ever made. It's nice that each slot machine has its own gimmick, but unfortunately that causes this one to be positioned in such a way it gets obscured by the heads-up display. The health and VFX gauges seem excessively large, and any kind of overlay clashes with the action film conceit anyway. You can think of VFX as a stamina gauge, which is a good fit for the frequent power usage you're expected to be doing, but it's not perfect because finding out exactly how much you have left necessitates taking your attention off the playfield. One thing that goes a long way towards fixing this is the eye-catching yellow flash that happens when the meter is almost empty. It's so extreme you can notice it with your peripheral vision, but it's always tempting to look up regardless. If you could track my gaze during this playthrough, I'd be glancing up top pretty frequently. I'll admit it's a minuscule complaint, but a game doesn't become this tightly designed without smoothing out such tiny wrinkles. One thing they could have done to please pedantic players like me is to make it so Joe's cape lengthens or shortens to represent how much VFX is remaining. I'll admit I'm sort of cheating with that suggestion since it's inspired by Journey, a game which released well after Viewtiful Joe, but that's an interesting point to consider in and of itself. Most people would look at a game like Journey and assume it has nothing to offer a 2D brawler, and yet I think it does. If the scarf indicated Joe's VFX level, then there could be an option to disable the heads-up display without crippling combat. Granted, not everyone will have 99 of each consumable like I have right now, but I've already put forward my case for why they could have just been unlockables instead. The life gauge also isn't strictly necessary since you always want to be avoiding damage and can only heal by picking up items from crates anyway. On an initial playthrough, boss health bars would have to be visible so the player can work out what tactics are effective, but by Ultra V rated you should know that already. And while we're at it, we could also ditch the massive slow text that appears when an enemy is dizzied. My point is, with just a few tweaks, disabling the heads-up display could even have been a mandatory feature of this difficulty level. Our brains do a good job of masking out information that's no longer relevant. If you've done a playthrough yourself, you might not even notice the slow text anymore, but the game still stands to benefit from ditching those elements altogether. Deleting the HUD would free up some screen space and make the game look much more like an action movie you play in real time, which is kind of the whole point. To that end, a replay system would have been a nice fit too. Nowadays it's easier than ever to capture a recording of your play, but back then it would have been a valuable selling point. You might think that's a big feature to bring up so casually, but many older games had a replay system of some kind which they used to generate attract mode videos. Viewtiful Joe's one is pre-rendered, so maybe they didn't have the necessary hooks in place for something along those lines, but the theory behind it is pretty simplistic. All a replay file needs to store is a recording of the time and duration of every button press, as well as a list of any random numbers that were used. In this case, those might be needed for enemies. Then, when you want to watch the replay, it's a case of activating a virtual controller and feeding it the inputs. If an enemy requests a random number, you just pull the next one from the list instead. With an efficient implementation, it ends up being a surprisingly small file size, but official GameCube memory cards only ranged from between 512 kilobytes to 8 megabytes, and even if that wasn't a problem, holding on to the relevant data until the player hit a save point might still have been infeasible, especially since checkpoints tend to be pretty far apart. Still, if the hurdles could be overcome, it would have been a worthwhile inclusion, both because it enhances the premise of making your own little action film, and because it would give players a better chance to comprehend the scoring system. Transparency is great, but I'll admit it can be difficult to understand scoring if you're struggling to stay alive at the same time. This is why it's important to be willing to take a few losses and experiment as you figure out a new game. Sometimes you have to go through a valley of punishment before you can emerge at a new peak of enjoyment. I often wonder to what extent a director's background influences development. Replays are the kind of thing which, if they're outside your area of expertise, can seem more complicated than they really are. To my knowledge, Kamiya comes more from the art side of things, so it may not have occurred to him that a replay system was within the realm of possibility. As the director, if he didn't know to ask for it, then the only way it would get implemented is if someone more familiar with the technology raises it as a possibility. Obviously, I'm just using that as an example. For all we know, replays were discussed and rejected, but my point is everyone has blind spots, which is where collaboration becomes paramount. This boss is called Gran Bruce, gran meaning great in Italian. I know it's supposed to be Italian because the standard white enemies are called Bianchis, the green flying ones are called Verdis, and the big yellow guys are called Gelbis. All of those correspond to their colours in Italian, but the commandos are just called Black Leaders, maybe because it would have been too repetitive to call them Nero Readers instead. Anyway, in the film Jaws, the shark is never given a name, but on set they called the puppet Bruce, so this being Great Bruce is obviously even more scary. Kamiya's juvenile one-upmanship is on full display here. This episode is 2 million leagues under the sea, 100 times further than the original novel, and equivalent to about 15 round trips to the moon. As you'll see, the last episode has plenty of Star Wars homages, but while Star Wars took place in a galaxy far, far away, Viewtiful Joe's version is far, far, far away. I'm sure it also takes place a long, long time ago too. The point requirement for Gran Bruce encounters is quite strict, so to be on the safe side, I let him get a little health back. Joe's characterization works to the game's benefit here. It's not so outlandish to imagine him showing off while an enemy catches their breath. Bruce takes much more damage on dry land, which gives this boss an improved sense of back and forth compared to the others, making it one of the better fights, but it also has an unfortunate quirk which can be frustrating. His aerial dash travels a fixed distance before instantly changing direction, but there's no indication of when that'll happen. If you try to jump over him at the wrong time, you can get snapped out of the air. Thankfully it's not random, so by standing at the back of the stage I know how to avoid him. It doesn't exactly qualify as unfair, but it can be an annoying thing to be snagged by. It's finally time to buy the VFX turbocharger. If this were a film, now would be a good time for an intermission. But it isn't. This part where you have to babysit a platform as missiles go by can be aggravating on an initial playthrough. I'm about to make it look easy, but don't be deceived. Even on subsequent attempts I'm not fond of this section, but it's a useful example regardless. This missile gimmick is lacking escalation. If you're at all interested in game design, then you've probably heard this one before. Maybe you can predict what I'm about to say. Rather than introducing the missiles, then the platform, then combining the two, it expects you to get the remote control, backtrack, fend off enemies, and work out what to do while missiles keep beating the screen. Basically, players aren't given time to acclimate to the new situation. Ideally, this would escalate in a way which guides players toward the right behaviour, or at least that's the conventional wisdom. I'll concede that this particular challenge isn't great, but it's not bad just because it dumps too much information on the player at once. It might feel bad on a first playthrough, but we need to keep in mind that Viewtiful Joe is a game which is at its best when it's replayed. If it did the gradual introduction thing, then a lot of that time might feel wasted on subsequent playthroughs. Devil May Cry wouldn't become a better game by dropping one frost on the player instead of two. Not only can those kinds of overwhelming situations be more memorable, they're often straight up more enjoyable the second time around because they keep pace with your increasing skill level. Granted, this approach has a greater chance of backfiring, the missile section might count as an example of that, but at least you could never say it's boring. For a game like this, maybe boredom would be the worst fate of all. I've spoken about the topic of fairness a fair bit in these videos, but there's an important distinction to be made between two different kinds. I think of it as initial fairness and subsequent fairness. Much of what you see in fast-paced action games fails the initial fairness test but passes the subsequent fairness test. In other words, there are situations you're almost destined to fail on your first attempt. Even if we assume 1 million people played Viewtiful Joe up to the start of this chapter, I would bet against even a single one of those players getting a Rainbow V rank at the start of this stage on their very first attempt. At least if we assume they all went in without foreknowledge. The time requirement is just too tight for a first try. Despite that, it's possible to get that perfect rank every time once you know what to do. That's the distinction. When people say arcade games were unfair, this is usually what they mean. Arcade games often have subsequent fairness, but are lacking on the initial fairness front. Initial fairness is fantastic, worth striving for, and ideal in a lot of situations. Viewtiful Joe, including those skull markers on lower difficulties, is a great example, but there's a serious case to be made that this kind of action game benefits from not worrying about initial fairness too much. If you ask me, it depends on what the game is going for. If it's more so an experiential thing, where most of the value lies in a sense of immersion or adventure, then initial fairness can be an important way of rewarding a player's observation or planning skills. Otherwise, it's arguably not that important, but if you dump too many unreactable or poorly conveyed situations on a player, then you can't be surprised if they never bother with a second playthrough, defeating the purpose of it all. Viewtiful Joe suffers from that to some degree because a few of its set pieces are both confusing and punishing when you first encounter them. If you happen to be someone who just struggled through this game once and thinks I'm being hyperbolic when I talk about how great it is, consider giving it another try. You might be surprised. As I said earlier, I don't find the VFX turbocharger to be game-breakingly good. If anything, it seems like they assumed you would rush to buy it as soon as possible on this difficulty. That said, there is one minor problem with it. Depleting the entire VFX gauge sends Joe into ordinary mode, where his transformation gets locked out until the first gauge segment refills. 6 seconds. You get a 3-second period of invulnerability during that time, which leaves 3 seconds of heightened vulnerability before it's henshin a go-go. Turbocharger reduces the recharge period to 3 seconds, but the invulnerability also continues to last 3 seconds. In other words, even if you slow dodge recklessly, you'll be ready to slow dodge again by the time you're vulnerable. Now that's not quite as broken as it sounds, because you're never going to accomplish anything by just slow dodging all the time, and you'll get a bad rank if you take too long, but it's the one case where buying an upgrade removes nuance from the combat. Players can't miss what they never had, so maybe it never should have been 3 seconds of invulnerability in the first place. If it was only a second, then buying the turbocharger would cut the vulnerable time down from 5 seconds to just 2 seconds. From the perspective of someone who never experienced what the current situation is like, going from 5 seconds of vulnerability to only 2 is a huge improvement. It would still be by far the most powerful upgrade, but it would also preserve that little window of danger as something to worry about. As a side note, I find it surprising how lenient slow dodge invulnerability is, considering how little invulnerability you get when actually hit by some sources of damage. Since Cromarties do a 4-hit combo, you remain vulnerable to all of those hits. On Ultra V rated, that amounts to 16 damage, while a fully upgraded Joe has 15 health, making it possible to die to a single enemy in about a second. As for Ordinary Joe, it might be fair to consider that a minor missed opportunity. In ordinary form, Joe takes double damage and most moves are unavailable, but there's no advantage. That makes sense since it's supposed to be a punishment, but I reckon they could have given that form some minor upside which would make it useful under specific conditions. This commentary is played as Joe, but Sylvia, Alistair and Blue are unlockable characters. If you try Alistair, you'll see he's a little different to the others. Instead of transforming automatically, he needs to manually activate or deactivate Devil Trigger, which enables most of his moves. Now that almost turns out to be a redundant button press, causing him to feel more clunky, but there's a couple of small quirks to him, one of which is that his normal form comes with a sword. Earlier I mentioned that Joe's attack strings have no special properties, but Alistair pulls out his sword instead of the final punch in a chain. That sword pierces through opponents and inflicts knockdown. Basically, Alistair's combos are slightly different depending on which form he's in. It's arguably not even enough to matter at all, but it's something. Unfortunately, Joe doesn't seem to have anything similar, and I don't have a workable proposal for what they could have given him. It would have to be something so tiny that even optimal play would only resort to using it a few times, because the last thing we want is Viewtiful Joe becoming a game about Ordinary Joe instead. Still, if there was some reason to be in ordinary form every once in a while, then they could have made it so that holding one of the triggers kept the VFX gauge from refilling, allowing players to stay in that form for as long as they like. It might seem dumb to propose that regular Joe have some kind of advantage, but I think you have to be willing to question the value of every element to realise a game's full potential. When I talk about nuanced mechanics, usually what I'm referring to are these kinds of little intricacies where something could have been set up in a black and white pro and con way, but instead was blurred a little to complicate a player's choices. You could say that all games are ultimately about decision making, so it's an important aspect to flesh out. As it is now, Ordinary Joe is just a failure state, but at least that means if you want some additional challenge, you can self-impose a rule that Ordinary Joe means game over. After all, you're not supposed to leave bloopers in the final cut. Alternatively, you could just play as Alistair. His Devil Trigger restriction makes him more difficult than Joe, but he does have one minor advantage. Again, nuance. Since Devil Trigger is what drains his VFX gauge, he can use max speed for longer. Joe's max speed drains the gauge twice as fast as slow or zoom, or even slow and zoom. Stacking powers doesn't increase the rate of consumption, it just drains at the lower rate unless you use max speed. I think that's because if zoom cost additional VFX, then players would be encouraged to spam it before and after every attack, similar to the Devil Trigger deactivation cost in Devil May Cry. As for max speed, it's often less useful than slow-mo despite the fact that it burns through VFX, but its crucial advantage is that it doesn't force combos to end. All of this works, but unfortunately combining max speed with zoom is both difficult and pointless. There's just no reason to ever do it, and controlling a much faster Joe with such a restrictive view is a recipe for disaster. Max speed seems to be the weakest of the three powers, mostly being used to build up multiplicand points or traverse the stage more quickly. This is another reason why it would have been nice for the fire buff to be more meaningful. There's two Jelbies here, one on-screen and one off-screen to the left. Baseballs are Jelby's ranged attack, which they'll normally only resort to if Joe is far away, but there is an exception. Watch the next one and you'll see he still throws a baseball even when I'm standing in front of him. He seems to have a preference for staying put and using that move. If that's true, it's possible he has some custom AI, maybe so as to ensure he acts as a ranged attacker while you fight the other one. Most likely, each enemy has a weighted set of decisions they can make depending on several factors, so tweaking those weights allows for some to take on different behaviours. In essence, they can have their own personality, which causes them to prefer certain tactics. We could see this as yet another cheap and efficient way of crafting encounter variety. I promise I'll let that subject rest now, but I've talked about it several times for good reason. I believe it's something Viewtiful Joe exemplifies well. It shows many different ways each fight can be adjusted, with several sometimes used in conjunction to great effect. I can't say whether that Jelby's behaviour was intentional, or even if it affects anyone else who plays the game. For all I know, it could be some kind of glitch, maybe arising from the fact that I'm playing on a Wii rather than a GameCube. All I can say is I've observed him several times and he always does the same thing. It's difficult to say anything about a game with absolute certainty because they are what's called a black box. It's technically possible to reverse engineer them, but that's difficult and time consuming to do fully. Without knowing how everything was implemented, it's only possible to make a probabilistic interpretation of its true nature. If you had access to the code, that special Jelby might stand out in a way he doesn't while you play. He's easy to overlook, and I can't say how many more enemies are tweaked to some extent like him. This is one reason why it's worth listening when developers themselves take time to shed light on their games. They can speak definitively about things in a way nobody else can. Metal Leos arrive earlier on the higher difficulties, even before the boss they're based on. Much of this game's value comes from the level of challenge it offers, but more challenging isn't always better. For the most part, enemy layouts improve on higher difficulties, which is a nice reward for tackling them. Ultra V-rated is the ideal way to experience the game, but it's an improvement because of increased variety, not just higher difficulty. Since you'll often be forced to avoid several attacks before you can kill them, there's no denying they're at least somewhat more challenging, but they're also much more tedious. Unfortunately for us, most Metal Leos are either mandatory or drop a film reel, so I decided to go ahead and kill them all rather than just skip a few. Assuming I'm not mistaken, then this video should include every encounter, apart from a couple of red leaders that spawn if you get past the missiles at the start of this stage. Curiously, this is the only episode without a Joker, unless he happens to be tucked away somewhere I'm not aware of. Flipping the slot machine upside down would have been a cheap and easy way to reuse it without repetition, so it's a strange omission. Outside of the boss rush, this is the only instance where you're expected to collect film reels while a boss fight happens. It's fortunate it turned out this way because it's possible to annihilate Alistair if you keep the pressure on. Forcing players to wander the whole arena for the film reel bonus gives him opportunities to use his more powerful and engaging attacks. If you remember all of the topics from last time, then I don't have to point out that reusing Joe's animations is an economical way to build a boss, but it is worth noting that some of the wind-ups are lifted from cutscenes this time. When Alistair does a sweep, he first goes into the pose Joe does before putting up his face guard. Still inexpensive, but also more fair with that increased startup. Fighting an evil version of yourself gives you a taste of what it must be like for those on the receiving end, which can help you feel more powerful in the long run. If you think about it from their perspective, there actually wouldn't be much difference between Joe using slow-mo or max speed. Anyway, it's possible to shut down Alistair's clones by throwing a boomerang, but as you can see, it doesn't always do what you want. In order to make its path look more natural, there's a curvature applied to its movement. That, combined with its target-seeking behaviour, makes it hard to predict. Thankfully, Joe's spin kick acts as a backup strategy for when Boomerang disappoints. It'll reverse or destroy any projectiles that hit while spinning. In a sense, you can think of Boomerangs kind of like AI teammates that just try to collide with the enemy. There's probably some deterministic code under the hood, but its behaviour is complex enough to make it unpredictable in certain situations. To some extent, we expect that opponents are like us, in that they go through better or worse stretches. Sometimes they might throw a brutal sequence of attacks at you, but provided they don't do that all the time, it still feels fair. Fluctuations are a natural way of keeping players engaged, but allies are perceived more harshly. When someone first starts playing Viewtiful Joe, Boomerang's behaviour might appear to be totally beneficial. After all, it doesn't require precise aim, and it might even choose better targets than the player would at that point. Unfortunately, over time our skill continues to increase, but boomerangs still make those same decisions, which can now be seen as suboptimal with more knowledge. You end up with a frustrating sense that you would have done better if only you could fully control it. It's tempting to think that lock-on could alleviate this unpredictability, but in many games lock-on just shifts the problem up one tier. In Devil May Cry, once you lock onto a target, you have absolute certainty about the direction of your attacks, but before you press the lock-on button, the engine has to interpret your intentions by choosing a specific target. That choice can be aligned with the player's intent by taking into account many different factors. For example, when the button is pressed, the algorithm can crunch through the direction the player is facing, the orientation of the camera, how close each enemy is, the state of the character, and the general threat level each enemy poses. At that point, it can make a reasonably informed decision about where to apply lock-on. That said, such a system still has the same problem as boomerangs. For example, it might prioritize more difficult opponents when in reality it's often more advantageous to clear out weaker ones first. Not to mention, the more factors go into the algorithm, the more opaque a black box it becomes, leaving players without a reliable way to predict the outcome of a button press. Boomerang nearly got me killed a minute ago, so I'm not about to forgive it, but when you apply this thinking to lock-on systems, it's clear that Viewtiful Joe actually suffers from this problem less than a lot of games. 3D action games have since become the norm, but this game, and the 2D action platformers which predate it, are a good reminder that lock-on isn't ideal. With the exception of Boomerang, this is something Viewtiful Joe has that Devil May Cry didn't offer. There's a directedness and predictability to almost every single button press, which can make the game feel self-contained and complete in a way that lock-on undermines. Boss fights always end the episode, apart from this one where we have to do our beautiful escape. It's funny that I've praised many mechanical nuances so far, but then you come across a moment like this where the clock has 600 seconds for no discernible reason. 10 minutes is plenty when it can be done in one, even stopping to kill that metal Leo, which is optional. It's weird, maybe they didn't want anyone to die by timer after a difficult boss, but even just lowering it to 4 or 5 minutes would have been generous enough. Anyway, this little change of pace is nothing amazing, but it's a well-constructed moment which serves a greater purpose of breaking up the rhythm the game had been falling into with regards to bosses. While it might be good to embrace patterns for low-level gameplay stuff, on a larger scale it's important to break them every once in a while so the overall progression doesn't become monotonous.
Time to go to work, guys.
The words "just go for it" have appeared on screen plenty of times by now, but they don't show up for every encounter because some are unranked. You're free to walk past them or even take damage during them and suffer no penalty. It's a little strange, but then again the scoring system is arbitrary in the first place. Unranked encounters have value because they allow you to play by your own rules for a little while. Without the pressure of conforming to what the scoring system expects, it's possible to toy around with enemies a bit more than usual. This system is subtly different from Devil May Cry, where missions were scored in their entirety. This time around, players aren't punished if they spend time looking for secrets or just admiring the scenery. Not particularly beneficial for Viewtiful Joe, but it is a refinement. For whatever reason, black leaders are vulnerable to launchers, which is a fine gameplay mechanic, but it took me a long time to figure out considering there's no real reason to try it. Since Cromarty's attempt to punish aerial combos, you could be forgiven for thinking that black leaders would fight back even harder in the air. As a player, you should probably be intrepid enough to use every skill on every opponent at least once just to see what it does, but conveyance is still important. The difference between knowing or not knowing about this trick is pretty extreme. Obviously this stage is made of repurposed assets, but since the lighting is quite simplistic, they would have had to recolor all the textures to achieve the nighttime look. For all I know, this version came first and the other one was made later, but you get the point. Either way, remaking a bunch of textures isn't quite as economical as tweaking some lighting values, but it gets the job done. Once again, this is well timed, where the repetition happens well before the end, still allowing some room for build-up during the final chapter. Even so, it's worth questioning whether this was a necessary inclusion. Despite some great efforts to make each encounter unique, the fact is Viewtiful Joe doesn't have much enemy variety. As a result, some of the later sections can begin to drag. The first half of this episode and the early parts of the final episode are the worst offenders if you ask me. Tanks only begin to appear at this point and there's a nice lava section coming up, but apart from that it's just a bunch of enemies you've already fought several times in some pretty straightforward arrangements. Including the boss rush, I'd say there's about 20 to 30 minutes of superfluous gameplay across this 3-hour video, so it's not bad, but there was a little fat left to trim. Even a short game can be too long. Still, it's hard to blame them, firstly because there are plenty of other games which are much worse offenders in this regard, but also because of publishing concerns. When Viewtiful Joe was released, digital distribution wasn't an option. A disc had to be put into a box with a manual and shipped to stores around the world, which then took another cut. There's a minimum amount of overhead on that process, which meant it just wasn't viable to produce high quality games at a lower price point. There were a few exceptions, but generally as a consumer you were paying a fixed price for every title, which was a pretty large amount on an average income. Given that one of Mikami's goals for this project was simply to improve the team members' skills, nowadays its scope could be reduced so it could be released as a download exclusive title at a lower price point. It's up for debate whether that would have produced a better or worse game, but it's nice to at least have options. The same is often true of games themselves. Given a few camera options, I'd be happy to make some tweaks. Notice how, when Joe jumps, the camera tilts upwards rather than following him into the air. This gives a stronger impression of it being manned by a physical cameraman on set, but it's less than ideal for the player. Jumping up to the jet isn't so bad, but falling back down, the chromarties on the ground only become visible a few frames before landing, and they don't wait until you're level with them before attacking. Using a more traditional system which simply moved up or down with Joe would give a better overview of the environment, alleviating that problem. Another recurring issue is how the camera doesn't track bosses or mini-bosses the way you might hope. Rather than sticking to Joe, it might be preferable if it was drawn to some point between Joe and the boss, with the goal of keeping both on screen as much as possible. To be fair, it zooms out a little during this encounter, which at least allows you to locate the jet overhead, but that's the bare minimum you'd expect. You've probably also noticed the zoom ability often neglects to keep the target in view. One reason for that is the camera seldom positions itself perpendicular to Joe. It prefers to shift a few degrees one way or the other, so it's looking at him from a slight angle instead. There isn't any particular reason it had to work this way, except that a flat angle could be considered a boring way to present the visuals. It might be an example of technological progress influencing design, since 3D consoles had been available for less than a decade. This idea of a 2D game with 3D visuals was still unusual at the time. Sprite-based graphics don't have the luxury of deforming in accordance with perspective the way polygons can. Setting the camera slightly askew adds some visual interest which wasn't possible on consoles just a few years prior. It hardly makes a difference most of the time, but when you activate zoom it becomes a lot more noticeable. You would think, since it's 2D, those kind of visibility issues would be eliminated, but unfortunately that's not the case. Personally, I think the view is a little too close most of the time, but it's important to keep in mind the image you're seeing here is not the one people would have seen when it came out. This is progressive scan through component cables to a modern screen, which is much more clear than interlaced through composite to a CRT. Any more zoomed out and some players would have been squinting to be sure which attack was coming their way. Even so, that doesn't excuse how awkwardly it's positioned during some platforming sequences, or how the zoom ability often results in you punching stuff you can barely see. It would be fair to say that the camera of Devil May Cry is worse, so in that sense Viewtiful Joe is a big improvement, but it's arguably more disappointing here because it should have been easier to perfect in 2D. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to realise that Rosettas are based on Captain Blue's moveset. They have different animations, but mechanically they're almost indistinguishable from Blue. Just goes to show what a big difference appearances can make. Unless you're hell-bent on analysing everything, you might not see past the illusion that they're a unique enemy type. It's obviously a good idea to recycle Captain Blue's moves rather than just having them appear for a few short fights, but presentation matters as well. Robot copies of Blue would be an acceptable substitute, like Metal Leo, but this is a little bit better. It might be surface level trickery, but it's still economical and doesn't cause any harm. Rosetta's animations are unique among enemies, but their low posture where they feign collapsing on the ground is reused for Sylvia. Or maybe Sylvia's animations were reused to craft Rosetta's. Sylvia is much more similar to Joe than Alistair. She's just a faster, weaker version of him, but it's worth trying out all the unlockable characters to see how the cutscenes differ. In another clever little inexpensive feature, the voice acting in each scene is garbled so it sounds like gibberish, and a new story is inserted through the use of subtitles. Of course, since they had to reuse cutscenes, the extra stories turn out to be mostly nonsense, but it's a fun thing to see at least once. You're supposed to get a bomb from this slot machine, but I'll be skipping that step by using my own Shocking Pink instead. This'll be the second bomb I've bypassed by using my own. The first was right before Hulk Davidson when Joe was whistling. For all intents and purposes, Shocking Pink is treated like a regular bomb. In all likelihood, it shares the majority of its code with those bombs, which is an obvious way to handle it, but games don't always get that right. Now, maybe you think that's not important since it's just an optional strategy, but if I tried to use a Shocking Pink and it didn't work, I'd be discouraged from further experimentation. If learning an action game is an exercise in problem solving, then it benefits from having a consistent, predictable set of rules. If a player makes a reasonable connection in their mind between two facts, then ideally they should be able to take advantage of that. For example, I know the lava fountain is triggered by a bomb, and I know I can summon bombs, therefore the bombs I summon should be able to trigger the lava fountain. We've all had moments where we've made that type of connection only to be let down when the game fails to honour it. There's a couple of other examples in this stage. My little fire walk earlier was one. In that instance, I'd say the game was actually taking a liberty in the player's favour, since a flaming aura doesn't imply immunity from lava itself, but you can see how it follows the same trend of rewarding experimentation. In a moment I'll be on a bridge, and if you pay attention during that encounter, you'll see I slide under a Bianchi who's trying to hit me. Their roundhouse kick causes them to hover in the air for a split second, which is reflected by their hurt box. Not only that, but if you happen to slide toward an opponent while they're throwing a high attack, it counts as a dodge, dizzying them in the process. Credit where it's due, that's rewarding to discover, but I think it implies that jumping over a low attack right before it connects should also count as a dodge, which isn't the case. We're getting into nitpick territory with that complaint, but I think it's valid and illustrates a larger point. Game designers might do clever things sometimes, like asking the programmer to make sure a slide also counts as a dodge, but if the designer makes an oversight somewhere, then that gap will be filled differently depending on how the programmer wrote it. Everything in a game ultimately comes down to programming, which makes programmers de facto game designers. To use a programming analogy, you might say programmers are the base class which designers inherit. Anything the designer doesn't implement defaults to the programmer's implementation instead. Shocking Pink might be one example where the programmer's version went above and beyond the expectations of the designer. You can do clever things with it because the engine treats it like a regular bomb in every regard. On the other hand, dodges maybe could have been implemented in a more systematic way by calculating where Joe's hurtbox is in relation to the enemy's hitbox, regardless of whatever state he's in. If it's a near miss above or below, then the effect could be triggered. Maybe that would make it too awkward to fight on slopes, so they ditched it, but my point is, consistency in the code can be felt and exploited by players in creative ways. There are facets of gameplay which everyone can help improve, whether it's how the rules are programmed, how tight the hitboxes are, or how well the audio-visual elements aid a player's perception. Coins or sake gourds are sometimes knocked out of an enemy when you hit them, which may seem to be random, but isn't. You get sake gourds if you're in slow-mo, when they're more likely to be useful, otherwise you get coins. Not only that, but they appear when you alternate between punches or kicks. In other words, if you use all punches, then you'll only get 1 coin for your first punch, whereas if you alternate every time you attack, you'll get a coin for every hit. Neither of those pickups offer a major benefit, so it's not necessary to understand how to extract them, but it's an interesting little quirk. Much like the way poses are determined by the VFX gauge, it's something which could easily have been decided by randomness, but was instead tied to a system whereby players could account for it. Even which part of the Super Mario Bros. Theme tune Joe whistles while volleying the bomb is dependent on whether he's in the air or on the ground. Maybe now you have a better idea why I find the much more chaotic randomness of Critical Dizzy's to be so strange by comparison. Depending on how much you care about optimal play, then coins and gourds being non-random could be considered a flaw because alternating with every attack becomes such a rigid constraint. As I've already said, Viewtiful Joe isn't a good score attack game though, so making it non-random at least introduces the possibility it could be useful somehow. If you happen to drop a combo, maybe prioritizing coins could claw back enough points to salvage your rank. This bridge has a fantastic vista. I'm sure I'm not alone in considering it the best scene from a visual standpoint. If you look closely, you'll see a golden red hot hotel sign from episode 2, which is now pulsating different colours. Kind of a shame they didn't work one of those into the foreground, but maybe it was deemed too distracting. Not the only instance of eye-catching signage throughout these city stages, since there's a lot of almost naked ladies if you look for them. This seedy side of the city is probably where the chapter gets its Midnight Cowboy style name from. As someone who sometimes drops a single swear word into an otherwise family-friendly video, I appreciate the commitment to theme. Sometimes you just have to say fuck it. The backgrounds have a simplistic style, but they're well executed and include a lot of unique assets which make each level distinct. In this case, your eye will be drawn towards the moon, the clock tower and the giant statues. For something which parodies Hollywood films, there's quite a lot of gothic influences to be found. The first episode, ending with a giant bat in a coffin, obviously pays homage to Dracula, but knowing how highly Kamiya thinks of the original Castlevania, its inclusion can probably be traced back to that game instead. Castlevania is also a sort of movie game. It's easy to see what a profound influence it could have had on Viewtiful Joe, right down to the film strip effect which frames the title screen for that game. I'd be willing to bet that ominous silhouette in the distance was inspired by Castlevania, but knowing a creator's influences can be a double-edged sword. Notice how I haven't said anything meaningful about that castle yet. I haven't given any thoughts or assessments on it, just pointed out that it was possibly inspired by an older game. Everything has inspirations from things which came before it. I think it's great that Kamiya is so forthcoming with that kind of trivia about development, but it is just that, trivia. Some little facts are fun to learn. For example, Kamiya plays the role of Six Machine, which I assume covers just about every robotic voice you hear throughout the game. Next time you get annoyed by the bomb alert in episode 3, remember you're being trolled by the master himself. Trivia alone is harmless, but without restraint it can distract from more meaningful topics. As for the castle, it looks nice, but I'm not sure it serves the game well overall. It's not clear to me whether it's supposed to be the same place from episode 1 or not. We ended up in the basement of that one, which doesn't give a good sense of how large it is. The silhouette makes for a striking visual, but it maybe sets up the expectation you'll get to visit the clock tower, which never happens. If some players end up disappointed by that, then maybe it wasn't worth the inclusion. There's plenty of nice scenery here, even if it was toned down. I tried to jump onto the first train that appears, but the collider sometimes blocks you from moving over it. At one point I did a perfect run of this level and got hit by the train thanks to that problem. A nice example of my point from the DMC commentary about difficult games being subject to more scrutiny. This stage has another one of those little magic tricks I'm going to point out, so if you'd rather preserve your innocence, you might want to ignore the next minute or so. The way games are programmed means that when you want to have a moving stage like this, it's often much easier to just scroll the background instead. It can be done the other way, but taking that extra step means making sure that all objects on the train inherit its velocity so they don't fall off, and modifying the AI so it won't get confused by how quickly it's moving around. Rather than go to all that trouble, it's more simple to fix the train in place and move all the cosmetic stuff around it, which is almost certainly how Viewtiful Joe does it. If it was only a scrolling background, then you might not be fooled, so the screen shake and swinging lights help complete the illusion. Films are often praised for using practical effects instead of CGI, which makes sense when talking about photorealistic visuals. A scale model or puppet might be fake, but at least it can reflect real light along with everything else in a scene. You might be thinking that games should do things the proper way too, but keep in mind everything happening in the code is ultimately filtered down into a 2D image on a screen. If that image would look identical either way, then the underlying reality of the program doesn't matter, at least not for our purposes. Each of these train cars has a red sake gourd hidden somewhere inside, so if you stay in slow-mo, move fast enough and time it right, it's possible to keep a single combo going for this entire level. The amount of time you get infinite VFX changes depending on whether you use slow-mo or not. In slow it lasts 120 seconds, otherwise it only lasts 30 seconds. By the way, while we're on the topic, the kanji on sake gourds is bi, which means beauty. Red sake gourds don't address vigilance decrement, since even though they cause the difficulty of an encounter to plummet, a player's attention will still be directed to more or less the same things. This is particularly true at the upper echelons of play. If you're going to the trouble of performing a Rainbow V rank run, you don't really want to do anything half-heartedly. There's always room for improvement. Even with infinite VFX active, I still want to move efficiently and avoid mistakes, so this stage isn't quite as relaxing as it might appear. Still, the tension has been reduced since in this scenario, slow-mo makes it impossible to take damage. Inaba has talked about intensity scaling, with the goal being to avoid player burnout and heighten the experience by strategically inserting a few spikes or dips in the level of challenge. Not a groundbreaking notion, but he had a good way of putting it which highlights an issue that might not be obvious at first glance. I'll paraphrase. Suppose we have an encounter with 3 Bianchis, about the simplest baseline fight you'll find in Viewtiful Joe. Then we play the rest of the stage, which maintains a consistent level of difficulty, and get to Chapter 2, which starts off with 3 Bianchis plus 2 Verdis. Of course that setup is harder than the first one, but it may not feel that way since I've warmed up compared to then. In other words, the objective truth is that the difficulty has increased, but my subjective experience is that the difficulty has actually dropped because my skills are outpacing it. If you want an encounter to feel threatening, the difficulty has to be raised by a more significant amount, but that can't go on forever, which is why dips become valuable as well. Reduce the difficulty for a little while, then boost it again, and that high will feel even higher by comparison. If we include Alistair, then we're about to go through 6 consecutive boss fights, so this extended period of infinite slow-mo might be a calculated choice. Discovering that it was possible to keep this combo going was one of the most enjoyable revelations for me. The possibility of racking up all these points would have been a fun thing to discover under any circumstances, but I have to admit at least some of that enjoyment came from knowing I'd be able to put it in this video, showing you something you might not have seen before. That gallery aspect Kamiya talked about in relation to arcades is even more evident in Viewtiful Joe with tools like zoom and slow-mo. In a way, this game was ahead of its time because most consoles are played at home. Sometimes friends are on the same couch, but in that case they're probably going to prefer something they can play together. We've since seen the release of consoles with dedicated video capture hardware, so we now take it for granted that we can watch unusual runs like this whenever we like. It's worth remembering that wasn't true back when this game released. Playing Viewtiful Joe in 2003, you were unlikely to have any audience and almost certainly didn't have a large one. Funny to think that 1 million or more playthroughs of this game have happened in complete privacy when it almost seems designed to be shared. Ease of recording and sharing footage has some upsides. Without those advancements, this commentary would never have come to be. If you made it this far, I'm hopeful you consider its existence a positive thing. Players can also collaborate by sharing finds and challenging each other to reach new heights. While there's plenty of upsides, I can't help but consider the possible downsides of any industry-wide shift. In this case, players possibly having their motivations hijacked by external factors. Achievements could be seen as another part of this phenomenon. Showing off can be cool, but playing a game just to show off strikes me as a poor reason to do it. The intrinsic moment-to-moment enjoyment should be a higher priority, but it's gotten harder to separate the two. Many people now play their games on consoles or with software, which makes it possible to retroactively export some prior length of time as video, which means, in essence, you're always being recorded. Arcades as physical locations have been on the decline for a long time, but now the whole world is like one big shared arcade. Kamiya's sense that there was something special about spectating and being spectated has been vindicated, but I worry that something was lost in the exchange. It used to be possible to know with absolute certainty whether you were playing a game simply for its own sake or not. Hard to feel that way when platforms are doing everything in their power to keep you hooked to their ecosystem. That's one good reason to play classics from time to time. Going back to a more minimalist setup can be revitalizing. Even though the score display was maxed out, points over 10,000 are still counted. I suppose it's limited to 9999 because it had to be placed in an action bubble, which would need to be even larger if there was a possibility it would have to display 6 digits. 9999 kind of looks more impressive anyway. There's a satisfying sense that you've broken something, gone beyond the limits, given 101%. The important thing is you're still awarded those points, so you're not punished for playing well. You can always tally the exact number later if you want. Instead of just having a skip option, I think it would have been nice if VFX powers were available during cutscenes, like so. Easier said than done, but if any game was going to do something like that, you'd think it would be this one.
Ah, it's my friendly neighborhood arch rival, but you're a little late. The ritual has begun.
I know you.
The name's Alistair. Nice punch back there, by the way.
What's this about a ritual? I hope you guys aren't up to anything weird. Kids are watching this too, you know.
Are they?
Right. Well, since you'll die anyway, I guess I can reveal to you our evil plan. Ahem. For many years, we have fought against Captain Blue for control of the world.
Alistair reading their plan from a script is a fun little moment. Games have become increasingly self-aware since their inception, so it was a little less common to see things like this back then. Even so, I feel the need to point out that despite how it might seem at first glance, this isn't a meta moment. Joe and Alistair are aware they're in a movie, but they're not aware they're in a game. When you think of it that way, nothing in Viewtiful Joe is meta at all. Even Joe showing off to the camera and the audience noises can be explained without breaking the fourth wall. I think the game becomes especially funny with that fact in mind. Joe thinks he's in the know, but he's not because there's still another layer of reality above the one he can see. In essence, he's just as oblivious as the movie heroes he admires, even when he's posing for the camera.
But you should realize you're just a sidekick. Let's see who's the strongest once and for all.
Like the previous fight with Alistair, this one would have benefited from some awkward film reels to take the pressure off him. Maybe it's for the best I made a couple of mistakes this time because you wouldn't even get a chance to see his attacks otherwise. Apart from how easy it is to stay aggressive against him, Alistair's fight is climactic because electricity is one of the only things capable of inflicting damage during slow-mo. This is another example of good conveyance. It's intuitive that even slowing time itself wouldn't be enough to make electricity any less dangerous. The value of that mechanic can't be overstated because it gave them a way of presenting attacks and hazards which can't be avoided by reflex. It introduces a slight tactical element where positioning becomes vital, so it's no surprise that later bosses capitalize on it more than earlier ones. Most other action games either have that tactical element all the time because players get locked into recovery animations, or never because players have a way of reacting to every problem as it occurs. For Viewtiful Joe, it differs depending on whether or not electricity is one of the potential threats. You really come to view it as the ultimate sign of danger, which is why Alistair makes such a good rival, at least mechanically. Narratively, it's a different story. Alistair doesn't get the kind of build-up his role deserves, just a brief glimpse at the end of the last chapter which leads into this final confrontation. Granted, Nero Angelo didn't say anything at all, so it's not as though dialogue is necessary for this relationship to work, but repeated encounters are valuable in establishing a villain. A player who fights a boss several times builds up their own relationship with them through gameplay, rather than just being told how they should feel. For that reason, recurring rivals have been a long-standing concept. Mega Man had Proto Man, for example. This is, however, Kamiya's second, if not third, attempt at the idea, which may have influenced him to adjust it. Change for the sake of change can sometimes be good, but it isn't always the answer. Well, it might not come as a surprise to learn that this mission took the most attempts to get right. The next save point isn't until after Fire Leo, which means this is 5 full bosses in a row, with the returning ones made more challenging by increased health and a reduced VFX meter. If you ask me, the increased health goes too far, especially since bosses aren't a highlight of this game, but the reduced VFX meter is a nice differentiation from earlier incarnations. This is also a notable point where collecting all film reels adds a significant amount of challenge, although of course that pays off with a larger meter for Fire Leo. As you'll see, I have to go out of my way for collectibles against the first 4 bosses. The worst thing about this episode is the missed potential of not reshuffling the arenas. For Charles here it might hardly matter, but it would make a big difference for the other 3, even if just a few platforms and obstacles were swapped around. Not even necessarily to make them harder, just to make them different. This seems like such an obvious way of improving the boss rush that there might have been some kind of technical roadblock. It's possible their AI was too rigid to be dropped into another environment without substantial changes. Regardless, it makes them more repetitive than would be ideal. This is going to take a while, so now's the time for some broader subjects. It might come as a surprise to learn that I don't mind this episode so much. Gran Bruce has a strict point requirement which tripped me up a few times, and you could argue there should be a save point before Fire Leo since there's such a long gauntlet leading up to him, but overall this stage is fine with me, even if it is sadistic when you fail. To put it in perspective, this one episode is longer than some entire games. When you know what you're doing, the first Castlevania can be beaten in about the same length of time, and that wouldn't even qualify as a notable speedrun. There's a fundamental point of game design that, to my knowledge, no developer has ever been able to overcome, the one of time and punishment. Most games are about success or failure. You win or you lose, and when the losing happens, it's expected there'll be some kind of slap on the wrist. If Joe had an infinite health meter, it would still be an engaging game as long as you cared about ranks, but players may never get to that point if they're not incentivized to care about the basics first. There has to be stakes for there to be tension, and players can only invest one thing to raise those stakes: time. Now, arcade cabinets also took your money for each attempt, but I think the phrase "time is money" has a lot of truth to it, and if time is money, then money is time. Some people have a better time-to-money conversion rate than the rest of us, but that's still the fundamental concept. People spend money to save time, and vice versa. In theory, there's other forms of punishment. Someday, developers might be able to stimulate parts of your brain that evoke pain without doing any real physical damage to your body. Until we enter that nightmarish hellscape, it seems as though we're stuck with just time or money as the only 2 choices. Not such a bad problem to have in the grand scheme of things. With that established, the question becomes how much players should be punished for their mistakes. As of this video, modern games have trended away from anything like Viewtiful Joe, where players run the risk of losing upwards of 10 minutes progress at a time. Instead, checkpoints are usually more lenient, which isn't necessarily a good thing. If you only consider punishment as an incentive for players to do better, then maybe this episode is too extreme, even for such a skill-focused game, but punishment also defines what is or isn't considered a success. What's great about boss rushes is that you need to be consistent. If there was a checkpoint between each one, with infinite continues as it might be today, then it'd be possible to brute force your way through by using terrible strategies and skills over and over again until the stars align. Instead, you won't even see Fire Leo until you can beat 4 other bosses, each one dependent on you beating the last. At that point, you need a certain level of consistency just to make it through, which is valuable. Avoiding mistakes over a longer stretch of time with mounting pressure is a skill worth testing, but more importantly, it's also indicative of a higher level of craftsmanship from the game. Let's say, for sake of argument, each of these bosses had a single, poorly implemented attack which was impossible to avoid under certain circumstances. Even if the probability of that situation arising was only 50% across the entire encounter, then this boss rush would not only require high skill, but also 5 consecutive correct coin flips. It might be the case that the developers aren't as skilled as the best players, but even so, that will quickly expose itself to be the frustrating lottery it really is, hopefully prompting them to change the move until it's consistently avoidable. You may think I'm being elitist about this because this happens to be a rainbow rank run, but that's not the point. In however many millions of playthroughs that have occurred, every single attack from every single enemy had the potential to be the killing blow for someone, somewhere. No matter who you are, when you're down to that last pip of health, you want to believe a no damage comeback is possible. Of course, if you're playing so sloppy that you're down to 1 hit point, you deserve some punishment, but I don't think you deserve to have a long stretch of time wasted playing out the rest of a level you can never complete. At the very least, that doesn't seem to fit the description of fair. When you think about it this way, any game striving for fairness should allow for damageless completion. Otherwise, a player could lose 95% of their health bar at the very start of a stage, carry on unscathed, then get to some poorly crafted encounter at the end of the stage where they're forced to take 5% damage. Regenerating health is the easiest way to sidestep that problem, but I suppose my distaste for that mechanic is outside the scope of this video. Call me old-fashioned, but being forced to take damage just isn't my idea of fun. Thankfully, Viewtiful Joe can always be beaten without any damage. No compromises. On a related note, Viewtiful Joe released at a time when life systems were going out of fashion, and ever since then there's been a persistent notion that lives are somehow an outdated mechanic. Not every game should have a life counter, but it does accomplish something unique from a mechanical perspective. Lives allow a certain level of leniency, but still encourage consistency. If you struggle with Fire Leo at the end of this chapter, lives allow you a few attempts to adapt before being booted back to the beginning. Once you're forced to restart, you might make it to the trouble point with an extra life or 2 the second time around, and again be given a few chances to move past the part that's really challenging you. In many ways that's ideal, because players spend more time replaying the part they're actually stuck on without completely undermining the gauntlet as a whole. Lives aren't outdated. It wasn't true then, and it isn't true now. Regardless of whether most designers really thought about that or not, I think that's the reason they stuck around for so long and why they could even make a comeback. They have their place as a nice middle ground between strictness and leniency. Every once in a while, a difficult game releases which prompts a conversation about whether reviewers need to be skilled for their reviews to be worthwhile. Clover's own God Hand sparked that debate at one point, and it's recurred several times since then. Something I've never seen discussed is whether developers themselves need to be skilled in order for their games to reach their full potential. I think the answer is yes, or at least it's something they need to be capable of simulating, like by testing a version which runs at half speed. There's a video of Kamiya playing Bayonetta not long before release, which shows it running much slower than usual. Perhaps just a result of it being unoptimized at that point, but regardless, it would allow for complicated techniques to be executed more easily. Even if a creator doesn't bother prioritizing higher level play, if their game makes a good first impression, there probably is someone out there who'll spend a lot of time learning its intricacies, which is where those deeper faults might show themselves. Nowadays, developers can react to some of those problems with patches, but if it happens to tie into many fundamental systems, it might require drastic changes that aren't viable after release. The unfortunate reality is that people can and do fall out of love with games as they dig deeper and start to discover things which weaken their enjoyment. To prevent that from happening, designers need to be able to see a few steps ahead, otherwise they're leaving it up to chance. This might just be the thing that separates solid design from exceptional design. If you're not sure what I mean by that, luckily for you, I have a few examples on hand. Think back to the very beginning of this commentary when I repeatedly dodged 2 Bianchis to demonstrate some of the intricacies there. I explained most of them, but there's another thing you might not have noticed. If you dodge the same enemy more than 5 times, you stop getting points for it. That encounter was unranked, so there was nothing stopping me from standing there all day dodging attacks to farm points. Placing a limit on the amount you can accumulate that way is necessary to preserve the integrity of the shop. A natural part of game design is copying successful elements from other games, even if only through a long chain of inheritance. It's hard to imagine Viewtiful Joe being what it is today without Mario to popularize the platformer, but there's some things that can only be done right by careful attention to detail. Even if another game had a similar way of defending against exploits, you would first have to notice that, at which point you're probably already thinking about how your own game might be broken. Another tiny nuance is that collecting food while you're at full health awards points instead, identical to green orbs, but they didn't forget to apply that feature to new objects as well. Sake gourds are capable of overfilling the meter, allowing you to bank a little more than normal. Not only that, but if the meter is already maxed out, the gourds award points instead. I can't say for certain what thought process led to that, but looking at the commonality between green orbs and sake gourds, we can make an educated guess. It's the idea that nothing should ever be without purpose. Pickups exist to reward the player. If they become incapable of doing so because Joe has full health or VFX, then that's almost the same as punishing them for playing well. The important thing is that each element retains some value regardless of the player's situation, otherwise they might as well not exist. Again, the only way to arrive there consistently is to think about each element from the ground up all the way to its logical conclusion. Viewtiful Joe shows signs of that, which I'd say makes it exceptional. Although there's still room for improvement. If you happen to miss even a single film reel, then there's no reason to collect the remaining 49 of the final segment, since you'll never be able to unlock it anyway. Granted, you might not realise that on your first playthrough, and on subsequent playthroughs you should have a much better idea of where to find the one you missed, but it goes against everything I just described. As far as I can see, the only way to solve that problem is to make each reel increase the gauge by a tiny amount, so they all remain valuable, but that's another clash of intuition and logic. Unlocking a big chunk of the gauge all at once feels great and leaves you anticipating the next barrier being broken. Getting an almost invisible boost instead doesn't seem like a good trade-off to fix a problem only a pedant would care about. Maybe it's an example where the cure is worse than the disease. By now, you might be getting tired of seeing me use slow, zoomed punches against every boss. It can make them feel pretty samey. They do have different attack patterns, so you're expected to perform plenty of engaging defensive maneuvers, but you're not given any viable options about which offense to use. Trying to beat them any other way will probably cause you to miss the point or time requirement. Restrictive offense is a common problem with boss fights in general, but it's seldom this blatant because the method of offense doesn't even change between bosses. It's not as though one is weak to Ifrit and one to guns, there's just Joe and his fists. Bosses are one way Viewtiful Joe feels like a complete reversal of Devil May Cry, which had a fantastic boss lineup. In Joe, these are by far the most repetitive, weakest parts of the experience. Rock-on attacks are off limits since there's no Bianchis to kick, the scoring system becomes more simplistic since there's no way to build a multiplier, and max speed only has niche uses, so huge chunks of the mechanics are irrelevant here. A boss fight will always have some sort of hook which makes it stand out from the rest of the game, but at the same time you would expect at least one of them to exemplify what's enjoyable about regular gameplay too. The vehicle mini-bosses do a much better job of that since you can use Bianchis as missiles against them to great effect. A few similar opportunities during bosses would have gone a long way. It's hard to highlight music during a commentary because I'm always generating sound effects, but I'd like to carve out at least a few seconds for the audio, and this happens to be one of my favourite tracks, so have a listen for a moment. Try to pay attention to both the music and noises if you can. Apart from some nods to the Jaws and 20th Century Fox themes, the music might be the area where Viewtiful Joe steps furthest away from its movie premise. You'd never mistake it for a film soundtrack. Of course, it isn't a film, and it's hard to imagine how it could sound more filmic while also complementing the gameplay, so I think they prioritized the right aspect in the end. There's a bunch of highlights on the soundtrack, like the car horn solo in the streets, the elevator music of the hotel stage, and the next stage where it takes on a more somber tone to build up the finale. That said, the audio mix does them all injustice by drowning them out with sound effects. Powerful sounds are important, and part of that power does come from volume. The noises themselves are also worth commending, in particular the subtle camera shutter sound mixed into strong attacks is an inspired touch, but the cacophony makes it difficult to hear the music most of the time. Apparently engineers used to joke that NTSC stood for never the same colour, but sound designers seem to have it worse. Even now, listening to the same game on two different speakers can produce startlingly distinct results, not to mention headphones or surround sound. It's an understandable problem, one I'll even struggle with in the creation of this video, but that's all the more reason why some volume sliders would have been appreciated. Anyway, as much as I like the music, I think it's also a major contributor to the fatigue I talked about earlier. Almost every track is high energy, the main exception being the underwater stage, which has a blaring alarm playing over it instead. I'm no expert on music theory, but I think a large part of it can be explained by an abundance of tuplets, moments where notes are split into multiples rather than held for the full duration. You can hear it most clearly in those parts where the music seems to get glitchy, but it's sprinkled throughout most tracks. It sounds hyperactive, barely contained, which is a great fit for moment-to-moment gameplay, but on a longer timeline it gets tiring, or at least I think so. Maybe I'm just more blue than Joe these days. Still, if you've never given the soundtrack a chance to impress you by itself, I think you should. There's a lot to like that's unfortunately hard to appreciate while playing. This spinning flurry from Fire Leo is tricky on Ultra V-rated. Unlike the ballerinas, it's not possible to bait out an attack by dodging the correct direction, and since the animation has no tell, you're almost reliant on audio cues instead. Leo has a higher or lower pitched growl which indicates what his next attack will be. Audio cues are useful in a few other places, most of all when a jet starts firing its machine gun. There's also a sort of squeaky shoe sound effect that happens when a Bianchi is going for a kick, which can help if you have trouble distinguishing those animations. I hope the last video convinced you that audio is an important part of action game design, but since Viewtiful Joe is 2D, it's not as vital in this case. That is, except here. Now it is just about barely possible to dodge Fire Leo's spin without sound. If you crouch, high attacks will miss by default, and there's a very short window of time where Leo descends before his sweep can hit, which allows you to tilt up instead. If you try it for yourself, you'll see it can be done, but it's much more difficult than just listening out for the growl. Having this one obstruction for deaf players is an obvious accessibility concern. Now, everyone has their own opinion on accessibility, it can be a touchy subject, but I'm not going to appeal to your sense of equality, charity, or anything so saccharine. All I'd like to point out is that it's actually possible to be in favour of at least some accessibility options without the need to include empathy in the argument. Nobody can say what the future has in store for us. Personally, I find it comforting to know I have puzzle games I could still fully enjoy, even if I lost use of much of my body. Worrying about your future self is all it takes to acknowledge that accessibility can be a good thing. Here's where it gets complicated though. Assuming we want to leave Fire Leo's moveset unchanged, then the only way to solve this problem is by adding an option for a visual indicator, but Ultra V-rated is built on the removal of indicators. If we give players the option to turn them on, even just for this one attack, then some percentage of non-deaf players will do so because a visual indication is easier to distinguish than an aural one. At that point, maybe it should just be the default for everyone. I think there's valid concerns to be raised around accessibility options since players could fail to cultivate skills if they avail of options they don't need. That said, even though I enjoy how it makes this boss a little different to the others, it's hard to justify when it's the only moment with this problem. It's one thing to be excluded from a game because the premise simply isn't compatible with a certain disability, and another thing to be excluded because a single oversight stands in your way. Still, even if I might consider this a flaw, my sympathy lies with developers anyway, because it's hard enough to make a game as is. Examine any game from as many perspectives as possible and you're bound to find something that could count as an accessibility issue. I've been pretty harsh on the bosses, so one thing I'll say in their defense is that they sometimes require you to have a good grip on all three VFX powers. At times it leads to flashy sequences that showcase those powers well, like how it makes sense to use slow-mo as you jump over Fire Leo in case you get hit by a meteor. The premise of VFX and the optimal strategy line up well during this boss. You get to use all three powers to great effect and end up making a fight scene that not only plays well, but looks good too. For the most part, this game's 3D rendering is just a stylistic choice. The camera pans and tilts aren't integral to the gameplay, but these curved arenas are one aspect which would be impractical if not impossible to represent through sprites. Here we can track Fire Leo's position at all times, even though if the arena was unrolled, it would take up at least 3 screens worth of space. In essence, we're seeing much more information than before, with the only cost being that the stage has to loop around on itself for that to work. The way technological advancements impact game design is fascinating because it opens up new possibilities while also acting as a pitfall, something this camera represents pretty well, I'd say. On the one hand, it's impressive to see 3D graphics being taken advantage of like this, even though it was an uncommon style for side-scrollers at the time. Seeing a game do something fresh while meaningfully taking advantage of that is impressive, but on the other hand, it shouldn't be that surprising. Once something gets accepted as commonplace, there's an unfortunate tendency not to question how it could be better. By contrast, when something is new, you have no choice but to consider all the implications. Again, it's that idea of thinking about something from the ground up and following that thread all the way to its logical conclusion. Viewtiful Joe uses those curved arenas at crucial moments to great effect. This room is an obvious homage to the Stormtrooper lineups of Star Wars. Seems Jedi troopers are equally expendable. The Rob robots in the background would have been a somewhat more obscure cameo back when this game released. Maybe that obscurity explains how they made it into the PS2 version, which you have to imagine caused some poor soul a sleepless night when it was discovered. Unless it never was, in which case I might be causing trouble by pointing it out, so don't tell anyone. It must have been a concern for someone because Joe's Mario-themed whistle was removed from the PS2 version. Anyway, it's funny how violence against robots is often seen as acceptable. You have to wonder how well that assumption will age. Since it's totally fine to kill robots, it's also fine to show the robot equivalent of extreme gore, which is why they break apart in accordance with their health, but that only takes effect after they're hit by a slow-mo attack. In other words, if you kill an enemy without using slow-mo, their model will remain intact until they abruptly die. You'll notice a lot of enemies in this playthrough go from looking unhurt to stripped down skeletons as soon as they go flying. That's how you know I did a good job of milking them for points before transitioning into Rock-On. On Ultra V-rated, a Bianchi can withstand 4 normal attacks before dying, but there's a slight randomization to it, meaning they can have between 5 and 7 hit points. Cromarties have between 16 and 18, Billies have between 10 and 13. This is possibly the most puzzling design choice of all. Elsewhere we've seen many aspects which could have been random but were instead made deterministic. Now it's the other way around. Most games give enemies a consistent amount of health, whereas here it's variable. It doesn't make any sense to me, but thankfully it's not that impactful because the goal is to kill in slow-mo where these differences are negligible. As long as you assume each Bianchi has only 5 health, you'll never kill one prematurely. If anything, its lack of importance makes it even more baffling, but I suppose that's also why I shouldn't dwell on it. This is all the more reason why it would have been nice if they broke apart as their health dipped below each threshold. That would allow players to see for themselves how much they have left just by assessing the amount of damage to their model. It's a bit like the suggestion I made for Joe's cape earlier, taking something which is normally represented by a gauge and building it into the world in a diegetic form. There's an argument to be made that hiding such information raises the skill ceiling in an engaging way since it requires players to remember how much damage they've done to each opponent. That's a logical conclusion, but following that logic further leads to some undesirable outcomes. Continuing that line of thought would lead you to conclude that the VFX gauge is also superfluous since players can keep track of that in their mind too. Even surfacing the details of the scoring system could be seen as a waste of time since an intrepid player would be able to figure out the boundaries and values for each move through extensive testing. We could even just give the player a single number at the end of their entire playthrough and let them work out the details by themselves. Obviously, cluttering the screen with gauges and readouts for every little piece of information isn't ideal either, but a line has to be drawn somewhere depending on whether you believe a better action game is likely to emerge with more or less information available to the player. If you play Kamiya's full catalogue, you'll see which side of the argument he appears to take. Not that I've been subtle about foreshadowing it. Thinking along these lines exposes the only real flaw with ranking. Time and combo being in direct competition with each other is good because it complicates choices, and if my brainwashing has been a success, you now believe decision making is the core of gameplay. You want to score points, which often means leaving enemies alive for longer, but you don't want to be grossly inefficient either. This encourages a balanced playstyle, which makes the most of your abilities. Unfortunately, since every encounter is different, the time and score parameters have to be tailored for each one, which means you don't know what's expected of you. If I ask you how fast is fast, you don't have an answer for me because it depends on the situation. Even now, I don't know the precise values of time or score required for each fight. I've just gotten a feel for it by replaying them. It didn't need to be this way. In fact, I think this problem could be rectified just by showing whether the player has reached a Rainbow V score yet. Since you can't kill all opponents, then focus on points, score always gets prioritized first, so just showing the player how they're doing on score would let them know when it's okay to prioritize time instead. That could have been integrated into the V on the right hand side. You can easily imagine it starting out empty and filling up as the player accumulates points, or even just turning rainbow coloured once the threshold is crossed. If we'd rather forego the HUD altogether, then the audience cheers could have been a way of signalling this instead. Maybe they could even chant support for Joe. Thankfully this is a flaw which fades into the background once you know the game well, but it's still a flaw, especially in the beginning as you figure everything out. It might even be reasonable to say this makes the game unfair in a way, because players will be punished with poor ranks for something they can't possibly know until they've gone through some trial and error. Tanks illustrate a couple of minor tweaks to slow-mo which make the game more challenging, more smooth, and more fair. Quick reminder, most enemies in Viewtiful Joe don't animate like regular action games. There's a cartoony wind-up and then a very fast attack. In the case of tanks, that means an audio cue followed by a red glow, then a shot. If Joe enters slow-mo while an enemy is winding up, then the attack will happen immediately. The bullet leaves the chamber. But if you're already in slow-mo when an enemy begins to animate, then they'll do the full wind-up before attacking. So entering slow-mo causes enemies to modify their behaviour, but being in slow-mo doesn't, and I think I know why. For most opponents, players are supposed to physically dodge each attack, only resorting to slow dodging if they make a mistake. So if you imagine a situation where a player has difficulty reacting to an opponent, then you can see why they might want to abuse slow dodge as much as possible. If enemies were oblivious to slow-mo, then you could wait for them to begin their wind-up, slow time until you're sure you know what they're about to do, dodge the correct direction, and then let go of slow-mo. In effect, you'd be preemptively using slow-mo as a failsafe, which is such a reliable strategy there needed to be some downside. That might be the main reason why slow-mo forces combos to end, so it can't be spammed like that, but even if you don't care about score, the game makes it more difficult to abuse by throwing the attack right away. Since the enemy is slowed, you still get a little more time to react, but they're not stuck standing there like an idiot. As a bonus, this also makes it easier to reflect bullets back at enemies that fire them, otherwise you'd have to time your slow-mo to coincide with the end of an arbitrary animation. On the other hand, if an enemy starts winding up while Joe is already in slow-mo, you don't want them to attack as fast as possible because the player could be about to deactivate it. They might be focused on a different enemy, or the VFX gauge might be running low. Sooner or later, they'd end up in a situation where an enemy just barely starts to wind up as the player disables slow-mo, which would cause them to be hit by an unreactable attack. To summarise, enemies act against you while entering slow-mo, but act in your favour while it's ongoing so you're not blindsided when returning to normal. Those adjustments are clever and worthy of praise, but I also feel the need to point out that they seem like they would be obvious changes to make while still in development. If you imagine playing without them, you'd see how slow-mo would be overpowered and some attacks would feel unfair. It was a necessary fix, but that makes it a good example of how subtle design decisions are easy to overlook. Sometimes the most important stuff is the stuff you don't even notice. Metal Leos are the only practical use I found for Viewtiful Forever. To my knowledge, there's no great way of scoring points against them, so the measly 50 you get for draining your VFX meter turns out to be the fastest way to ensure a V rank. Since I'll be doing Viewtiful Forever a lot over the course of this episode, I decided to show off all the poses one last time. This stage is where the Metal Leo spam is at its worst, which isn't a great note to go out on, but thankfully the ascending section at the end redeems it somewhat thanks to its variety. Still, it's disappointing there's no robot versions of other bosses as well. Metal Leos only have some of Fire Leo's moves, so similarly stripped down versions of Charles and Hulk would have been a nice change of pace. Even a Gran Bruce robot could work with a jetpack. He probably deserves an animatronic version more than the others given his namesake. I'm gonna chalk those omissions up to time constraints, but it's still a shame. This is the final save point, but I think we have time for one last trip to the concession stand. Hopefully you found that as satisfying as I do. There was only 10,000 points left over, so all that scoring paid off in the end. I think that qualifies the shop system as well balanced, but at the risk of ruining it, I have to be honest and say if I hadn't scored enough points, I would have just not bought them. Since I wanted to avoid damage, health upgrades are irrelevant anyway. In reality, I was able to buy everything I wanted from the end of the second episode. That's not necessarily a bad thing. As I said before, I think it's better to introduce everything early rather than run the risk of leaving it too late, which could ruin the pace for subsequent playthroughs. The shop could be a bit more costly though, since players have the option of buying their preferred power-ups first. Chances are the stuff they'd be getting later would be things they don't really value anyway. Speaking of value, players are enticed to care about scoring because it acts as currency. That makes it a strong extrinsic motivator, but once you get good enough, even on a fresh playthrough of the highest difficulty, that aspect becomes irrelevant about 1/3 of the way through. So far, I've extolled the virtues of a well-implemented ranking system, something I hope I've convinced you of and which I think may be Viewtiful Joe's greatest improvement compared to Devil May Cry. That said, there's also the unfortunate reality that ranking kind of doesn't matter. It's an arbitrary layer over the rest of the mechanics, which players could be incentivized to care more about. As you can tell, I'm happy to chase ranks. I hate seeing anything less than that lovely rainbow at the end of an encounter. Shoving the letter in your face like that goes a long way towards pushing players to do better, but I can see how, logically, you might just shrug it off. Since the concept is that we're filming an exciting action movie, it makes more sense here than in most games, but it's still not integral to the gameplay. With that in mind, you might consider it a missed opportunity not to capitalize more on the premise by giving players additional reasons to care about ranks. For example, maybe Sylvia's reaction to Joe in the previous episode could have changed depending on the player's performance. Some people won't care if Sylvia finds Joe unimpressive, but some will. A good or bad narrative outcome seems to be one of the better ways of motivating players for whatever reason. The implied audience could also have been a mechanic in its own right, where too many bad ranks causes them to leave the theatre, resulting in a game over. Apart from shoving the ranking letter in your face so blatantly, Viewtiful Joe seems content to assume you'll care about ranks as a matter of course, which is true for some, but not everyone. This is my favourite twist on the slot machine concept. You've been spending the whole game using slow-mo to time it right, so of course, at the end, you have to use max speed instead. It's nothing major, in fact it just means you press a different button, but it's a perfect little inversion of what you've come to expect. Coins magnetize the Joe once he gets close, but also if he's far away, maybe so players don't lose them if they fall somewhere inaccessible. I'm about to exploit that by waiting for them to come to me, which is a nice trick, but I think collectibles also lose some of their intrinsic value when they float towards your character. There's something more enjoyable about having to physically reach out and touch an item all by yourself. As a result, coins aren't as satisfying as they could be, but I still think it was the right choice so as to keep the focus on combat, rather than scurrying to pick up collectibles all the time. Against this Metal Leo, you'll see Viewtiful Forever 3 times. The first two are for points and poses, but the last one is done on reaction, since I end up slow dodging an attack I would have preferred to avoid outright. If you happen to slow dodge while the VFX meter is low, then there's no downside to triggering Viewtiful Forever, since the gauge is going to deplete either way. To be precise, it does lock you in place for a moment, which might be a bad idea in some very specific circumstances, but you'll be invulnerable afterwards anyway, so it's hard to imagine a situation where that would be a problem. Combined with Ōkami, this gives Viewtiful Joe an interesting aspect not present in other action games. Failure can become success. Chances are, if I hadn't told you that third Viewtiful Forever was unintentional, you probably wouldn't have picked up on that, and even if you did suspect it, you'd have no way of proving it. The same is also true of Ōkami. In theory, you could get hit on purpose just so the little film you're making is more exciting. As long as you execute Ōkami every time, your rank will remain intact, so it's a valid technique. You're even awarded 20 points for pulling it off. It might even be the case that, if you want to maximize points, Viewtiful Forever and Ōkami are crucial techniques. Unlike regular dodges, neither of those moves ever stop scoring points, no matter how many times you use them against a single opponent. Since Viewtiful Forever damages the enemy and Ōkami damages Joe, you can't abuse them forever, but you can milk a lot of points from certain enemies that way. Again, I don't think it's worth worrying about optimal score in this game, but you know that by now. Being given the chance to salvage failure is surprisingly rare in action games if you think about it. Devil May Cry had a condition where, if you got grabbed by a marionette, you could activate Devil Trigger to nullify most of its damage, so that might count as an earlier example, but I don't think it's quite the same thing. Dante still eats the entire attack, he just doesn't lose as much health. Viewtiful Forever and Ōkami do a little more than just cancel damage. They bounce back in flashy ways that could be seen as intentional, even if they're not. This is quite a lengthy stage, so I'd like to broach a more general topic before we get to the finale. Viewtiful Joe sticks close enough to its 60 frames per second target, but there can be extended dips when a lot of effects are in play, which gives us some insight into how it was programmed. Broadly speaking, there are two ways to build a game loop: frame dependent or frame independent. If a game is frame dependent, then when the frame rate dips, the action itself slows down. In other words, time only advances as each frame is drawn, so if we experience an extreme drop from 60 to 30 FPS, then we'll perceive the game as running at half speed. Any shoot-'em-up fan knows that sometimes causing chaos on screen can work to your advantage because the slowdown gives you more time to react. Viewtiful Joe behaves this way, as do most games which are older than it. You can see it pretty often in this chapter thanks to all the environmental hazards which impact performance. The alternative is where the frame rate and underlying simulation are decoupled from each other. In other words, if a frame isn't ready by the deadline, it gets dropped, but time continues to advance. Then, when the next frame is shown, we've skipped forward a little bit. If it's just a minor dip, this might be almost imperceptible, but if it's more extreme, it might result in a lurch, where the action on screen suddenly catches up with what's really happening in the game's logic. Most major modern engines are built this way, and it's generally seen as the more robust and correct way of programming a game. There's a lot of benefits to that approach, not least of which is the ability to easily release a 30 FPS version for some consoles and a higher spec version for PC or other consoles. 60 frames per second isn't even the limit anymore. I've tried 144Hz, and in an ideal world I'd experience every action game that way. Since Viewtiful Joe uses the older, less sophisticated method, it's tempting to call that a flaw of its construction, but it's not so simple. Frame-independent programming has a crucial downside which is often overlooked. Let's imagine a scenario where an enemy attacks the player right as a significant frame rate dip occurs. The AI chooses to attack, triggering the first frame of its animation, which will be almost indistinguishable to the human eye. For whatever reason, the frame rate happens to take a hit at that moment. The current image stays frozen for several frames worth of time, during which the underlying simulation continues to advance. Assuming you don't clip through the floor thanks to some physics mishap, then when the next frame is drawn, the enemy skips the missed frames and is now partway into their attack. It's only at this point where the player can actually perceive and react to the threat. We already established that the reactable window for visual stimuli is around 300 milliseconds. It stands to reason that a hardcore action game will have at least one enemy who brushes close to that window so as to provide a difficult challenge. In that case, just a few lost milliseconds might be enough to cross the threshold from fair to unfair. That particular problem will never happen in a frame rate dependent game like Viewtiful Joe. The worst case scenario is just some slowdown. That comes with its own downside because it makes the timing on your own attacks variable, which can throw off your inputs, but that's less likely to have serious consequences and can be solved to some extent by input buffering. Personally, I value unlocked frame rates because of the long-term benefit it provides where performance continues to improve as hardware advances. Even so, there's an argument to be made that action games actually benefit from being frame rate dependent. It's something worth considering at least, but I suppose I should point out that this is irrelevant if the game is capable of consistently hitting its target. The real winning move is to make sure there's enough wiggle room so that frame rate dips never occur in the first place. Easier said than done, but that's usually the goal. By the way, all of this could be seen as yet another argument in favour of strong audio cues. Sound is processed at a much higher frequency and with dedicated hardware, which means it's not really susceptible to those kinds of problems. So not only is it a useful off-screen indicator and processed more quickly by the human mind, but it can also operate regardless of frame rate. Doesn't get much better than that. Now that we're nearing the end, it might surprise you to learn that VFX powers weren't part of this game's initial design. In the finished product, they're an integral component, but the concept didn't include them in the beginning. According to Kamiya, the idea only appeared as he watched one of the programmers scrubbing through animations. He saw Joe moving in slow motion and wanted to be able to do it himself. Given how tightly constructed the core gameplay ended up being, you could be forgiven for thinking it came first, but that's not the case. It wasn't the case for Devil May Cry, and it also won't be the case for Ōkami either. This time around, the project was stalled for a while until Inaba lit a fire under Kamiya, basically telling him enough screwing around, which Kamiya credits as a decisive moment. Asked how Kamiya arrives at a finished product, Inaba denied he's some kind of genius and instead said he needs a long time to think about everything. I suppose Inaba's skill is knowing when long enough is long enough. By the way, I only learned this fact after all the stuff I wrote about this game being well considered, so I'm submitting this as yet more evidence for that claim. It feels well thought out because it was thought about a lot. It's not rocket science. This does beg the question though, whether it really is best to just go for it. Maybe more accurate advice would be just think about it instead. Assuming that origin story for VFX is accurate, then it's interesting to think Kamiya might never have had the idea if Viewtiful Joe used flat 2D graphics instead. Even the most detailed sprites don't animate in slow-mo the way a 3D model does. The nice thing about 3D animation is it allows the engine to interpolate as many times as necessary between two keyframes. Once the hard work is done, you get a theoretically infinite number of in-betweens for your effort. By contrast, a sprite animation played back at half speed would probably just look jerky, mistimed, or otherwise weird. To get the same effect as Viewtiful Joe, you'd need more hand-drawn frames to convey the idea that time itself has slowed, which is far from impossible, but might even double the workload. So not only would we probably not have VFX, but even if the idea had come along, it would have been much harder to implement. There's a nice feedback loop there, where the technology inspired the idea, and the idea was more feasible thanks to the technology. Some good ideas are more timeless. You might think it's a waste of time if I point out that pickups can be used to guide players through platforming challenges. After all, that's something everybody knows, right? Well, according to Kamiya, designing the maps for this game was an eye-opening moment for him because he put down a parabola of film reels over a jump and realised that was why Mario coins were often arranged in such a way. He said he used to operate on instinct more than logic, but once he realised Mario had already solved that problem, he started paying more attention to the games he played, looking for lessons he could take from them. If you ever feel your knowledge of games is lacking, just remember the director of Devil May Cry hadn't yet realised what purpose coins serve in Mario. Granted, this was back in 2002, when developers were less open about their design process than they are now, and it's probable that Kamiya subconsciously had learned the lesson, which is why he arranged the V-films that way in the first place. But it just goes to show there's value in stating the obvious from time to time. Speaking of, since I've included the credit sequences for both games, this is something you could piece together for yourself, but since nobody pays attention to that stuff, it might surprise you to learn that Devil May Cry and Viewtiful Joe have almost no personnel in common. Given how Devil May Cry 2 turned out, you could be forgiven for thinking that most of the staff moved over to Viewtiful Joe, but the actual number is just 4. The translator, one of the composers, the director, and the executive producer. By contrast, at least 17 staff from Devil May Cry would work on Resident Evil 4, again. The rest were presumably scattered to various teams, with few working on Devil May Cry 2 either. Anyway, for the purposes of this video, what's important is that Viewtiful Joe establishes Kamiya's career as more than just a couple of flukes. It didn't grow out of Mikami's design like Resident Evil 2, and it wasn't a Resident Evil project gone sideways like Devil May Cry. Knowing what to keep and what to throw away might just be the most important part of evolving in any creative field, something I think these games demonstrate. If you get hung up on all the little similarities like the shop or ranking, then it's easy to see Viewtiful Joe as an evolution of Devil May Cry. But if you forget all that for a moment and just watch them side by side, then it's plain to see they're also very different. I hope that these videos can be informative about action game design in a general sense, but I think I'd also be doing Kamiya a disservice if I didn't say that there are no rules. Clever iteration on past ideas is valuable, but I'm not sure an exceptional game has ever been made just by following a blueprint. Even Resident Evil 2 is beloved more for the ways it twisted the established formula than how it followed it. All those little intricacies and details I've highlighted are important, but equally important is that harder to articulate quality you can find in common across these games, using old, tried and true methods to prop up fresh, new ideas.
Joe!
Oh my gosh, it's you! How? Why?
Right again, little one. I am Blue, the creator of this land, the lord of this world. Oh, how trivial, how inconsequential do heroes look from where I stand.
This cutscene always makes me wonder whether or not it's okay to co-opt such a major spoiler, even if it is done in a satirical way. Chances are you know what film this scene is pulling from, but if you don't, it's possible the original will have slightly less impact should you ever get around to watching it. We could get hung up on the entire concept of originality here though. It's unlikely even the film in question was the first to do that kind of twist. For all I know, it was pulled from some earlier film. Take Star Wars as a totally random example. On the surface it seems highly original, but it owes a lot of inspiration to the likes of Flash Gordon. Still, the concept of a spoiler seems valid to me, as you could tell by the intro to these videos. It's true that even the most original games have some recycled ideas or commonalities to others, but it's also true that you can only ever really experience something for the first time once. After that, your brain will have been rewritten by the events which took place. If it is possible to experience something with a totally fresh mindset more than once, I can say from personal experience it must take more than a decade of abstinence, because even revisiting games after that long isn't quite the same. Forgotten things have a way of resurfacing once you engage with them again. So far you've seen a lot of spoilers in this video, but it's not too late to switch off if you'd rather experience the final boss for yourself. Now's your last chance.
My daddy died.
Sylvia, deep down you should know the truth by now. The same blood courses through our veins. In a way, it is true that your father has died. In his place stands the master of the world, the all-powerful controller.
Actually, in this situation, I'm the all-powerful one since I can do this. Before this fight starts for real, I'm going to demonstrate how King Blue can be locked in place by spamming boomerangs. This fight takes an unreasonable length of time anyway, so I'm doing us both a favour. When you see something like this in action, it becomes more understandable why bosses typically have a way of becoming invulnerable for a moment to recover from a player's combos. Otherwise, all it takes is one little oversight to ruin a fight. At least in this case, you'll get a bad rank for over-relying on boomerangs. Anyway, even though you've just evened the score by jumping into this enormous mech, the character design does a good job of making Joe out to be the underdog. King Blue is loaded with as much regal and mystical imagery as they could cram on, whereas the raised carapace on Sixmajin doubles down on Joe's insect-like iconography. It's best the player not feel too empowered at this point. That's something which needs to be earned through gameplay for this fight to have a payoff. Obviously the scale of this insane mech battle is impressive, but I think this is also the point where problems with the story take their toll. It's never made clear to what extent Movieland is real, or what would even happen if Jado were to somehow escape from there. At the beginning, Sixmajin gets knocked into the real world, but since it's coming out of a movie screen, it's scaled down significantly. If King Blue were to escape from there, it would be a problem, but I don't get the impression it's something humanity couldn't deal with. On the other hand, him staying in Movieland doesn't seem so bad either. Joe has never met a friendly inhabitant of this place, and it's hard to imagine how someone would survive on the ground with such huge mechs walking around. They're so big, they'd be exerting a notable amount of gravity over the entire planet. I realise how ridiculous it sounds to be bringing realism into the equation at this point. The entire premise is fantastical. There's talking animals and superheroes walking around a place literally called Movieland. Still, the entire point of having a story is because it's supposed to add something to the game. A simplistic one like this really only has one axis we care about: tension. How much trouble is the hero in right now, and what can he do to overcome it? Tension goes up and down as we move through the various acts, culminating in this big climax. At this point it seems as though we're supposed to feel that the fate of the entire world is at stake, but that doesn't really land, for me at least. Some similarities can be found between King Blue and Mundus. They both attack more by sending out projectiles than doing anything physical themselves. Unfortunately, King Blue is much more rigid. He still has overlapping attacks, but they arrive in a fixed pattern which you'll see repeat 9 times before it's over. Would be 10 if not for the boomerangs. On the plus side, this guarantees you'll never get hit by an unfair sequence, but it also gets repetitive, doubly so on this difficulty. we all have different ideas of how long a boss fight should last, but if a player does something 9 times in a row, the chances of them slipping up on the 10th cycle seem pretty slim. Since this'll take a while, it's time for one more diatribe on the second sphere virtue of fairness. Both phases of this boss have lightning attacks, which is good since that's Joe's primary weakness, but there's no indication of where those strikes will occur. Compare with Griffin from Devil May Cry or Alistair from this game, and the problem is obvious. In both cases, lightning has a faint tell before striking, giving players a chance to avoid it on reaction. Obviously, King Blue's attacks have subsequent fairness, but it's an example of something which could have had initial fairness as well, with a little warning. Avoiding lightning strikes solely because you've memorized where they'll appear isn't much fun. It's a disappointing problem for a final boss to have, all the more so because it's usually avoided, which shows they must have known it wasn't ideal. Even in this same fight, the missiles I've been dodging have 2 patterns which can be predicted by how they appear in the background first. That still fails the initial fairness test, but at least once you understand them, you have something to engage with. By contrast, it's hard to imagine an argument why standing still when King Blue summons lightning makes for compelling gameplay. The only plausible excuse I can come up with is that they added those moments as downtime in case the player doesn't have the turbocharger, which still seems like a weak justification. The next phase has a similar problem with lightning, but it's much better overall, both narratively and mechanically. King Blue is all about environmental hazards, whereas Captain Blue is just a straight up battle between 2 superheroes. Although I prefer the second part, it seems like it would be anticlimactic if it just went straight to that fight. These 2 phases enhance each other somehow. I think it's because the bigger one satisfies, or at least attempts to satisfy, the desire for an increased sense of scale and importance during the climax. Once that's over, it becomes easier to appreciate something smaller and more intimate. King Blue is imposing, but also impersonal, as though he's just an obstacle to the real conflict with Captain Blue. It gives you an opportunity to peel away the pretense, dragging Blue down to your level so you can beat him at his own game. The fate of the world might be at stake right now, but when it's your pride on the line, that's somehow more important. So even though the individual bosses may not be as good as Devil May Cry, at least the pacing is better. Again, I don't think either of these fights represent Viewtiful Joe at its best, but Captain Blue being so fast is a highlight. I suppose he technically moves around slower than Alistair, but unlike Alistair, he's trying to attack Joe the whole time. Going up against an opponent using max speed is a perfect way to end the game. His attacks also seem fine-tuned to the point where he puts up a great fight without ever being unfair, which is impressive considering his place as a short capstone at the end. It's the one instance where increased health is a positive on Ultra V-rated because it's over a little too soon on the lower difficulties. Anyway, I've been talking for 3 hours already and the next part is very fast-paced, so I'm gonna let it speak for itself. Just remember, I never said this would be a no-damage playthrough. Don't be disappointed. To quote Joe, things always have to go wrong once before you get to the happy ending.
Nice try. Right up my Nice try.
Alright, I might have misled you, but I bet you felt a little tense if that was your first time watching. This strikes me as an advantage unique to games because even if you replay them, there's always the chance you'll slip up. Some films lose their impact after the first viewing because too much of their value is based on the tension of not knowing what's going to happen. If you re-watch this video, you'll never worry about me taking damage again, but if you replay the game, you'll worry about it constantly. This is why it's not a problem for a game to have a more straightforward story. The outcome is never certain. If you've played the first Ace Attorney, then the music for this scene might sound familiar.
All I ever wanted to do was to create heroes. True heroes the world needed. And as if to answer my prayers, I was sucked into one of my films.
One of the composers for this game is Masakazu Sugimori, who worked on Phoenix Wright. The initial Japanese release of that game predates Viewtiful Joe by over a year, so this one is the remix. Since it has a certain melancholy vibe, it also plays during a flashback in that game too. Maybe you should experience it for yourself. Both games share another staff member in common, Kumiko Suekane, who did character design and graphics for both. Apparently red is seen as a heroic colour in Japan, which might be one reason why it's such an obvious commonality between Dante and Joe. In Phoenix Wright, the hero is blue, which maybe says something about how that game portrays the Japanese judicial system. Before moving on from that, a little more related trivia. Kamiya pestered Shu Takumi, the director of the Ace Attorney series, to let him voice a character. As a result, he would go on to appear as the voice of the main prosecutor in the third game, Goddo. When asked to shout "objection," he took it upon himself to adapt his character a bit and shouted "objection, baby" instead. Unfortunately, they made him do it again the right way. As of this video, we're 15 years removed from the release of Viewtiful Joe 1 with no third installment in sight, so I think it's fair to say that this trilogy tease was a mistake. That said, it could still come to pass, even if Capcom never does it. Someday the copyright should run out, at which point Viewtiful Joe 3 will be a free-for-all. Whatever happens going forward, it seems less than ideal though. The best time to finish the trilogy has probably already come and gone. To me, it comes across as arrogant to end on a cliffhanger, since it was never a sure thing that this new intellectual property would be able to sustain a sequel, let alone two. You still get the sense of having closed an important arc in the overall narrative, so it's not an unmitigated disaster, but it can leave a bad taste. I doubt we'll ever get a concrete answer to this, so I'm going to speculate about something here. Given how this scene plays out, I think what happened with Devil May Cry 2 had a negative effect on how Kamiya approached the ending to Viewtiful Joe. Years later, when talking about how he would have gone about making a Devil May Cry sequel, he said he would have made it a Dante and Trish game. It's hard not to see Joe and Sylvia as a revival of that idea, but here it's made much more explicit. By addressing this point at the end of Game 1, Kamiya exerted control over the direction of the series as a whole, because even if he didn't go on to make the sequel, which we now know is what happened, it would be almost impossible for the next director to ignore Sylvia as a playable character. She goes on to become part of a tag team with Joe in the next one, so if that was his plan, it worked, but I think it caused him to put his own needs ahead of the players. Hard to blame him given what happened with Devil May Cry, but still not ideal. Sequel teasers can be enjoyable, but given how much time and energy a player needs to invest to see the ending, this is the right time to make sure they're totally satisfied. Not enough emphasis was given to what Joe accomplished in this arc. Even just saving the sequel bait until after the credits would have given a chance for the good stuff to sink in first.
But you know, in the movies,
There always has to be a plot twist. That means that things always go wrong once before you get to the happy ending. Isn't that right, Joe?
that's my girl. This is where the story really starts getting interesting. Come on, partner, lead this to
Viewtiful Joe and Sylvia!
While the credits play out, here's a few things I didn't have a chance to talk about. When Joe dies, an inverted freeze frame effect happens for a second. On top of looking cool and giving the killing blow more impact, it allows you to more easily understand what mistake you made by keeping it on screen a little longer. Since the gameplay is 2D and Joe's movement is digital, it would be possible to play Viewtiful Joe on a Super Nintendo controller with no loss in complexity. The director has a different pause quote for each stage. Next time you play, try pausing more often to hear them all. This missile section at the start of episode 4 would have been a lot more difficult if they hadn't put slanted edges on the sides of these pits. Those little slopes funnel the platform down to safety, the level designers secretly working in your favour. If you really can't stand that section, then you might be interested to know it's possible to get past the missiles without taking damage and without using the platform. I'll leave that as a puzzle for you to work out. Consider it a chance to apply your problem-solving skills. As long as you never trigger the "just go for it" prompt, you're not punished for skipping an encounter. By bypassing the missiles, it's possible to get a Rainbow V rank for this episode with just 3 rankings. The memorization section has some degree of randomization to keep it engaging on subsequent playthroughs, but it always picks one light from each column, so you always have to jump 3 times. There's a small raised stone between these 2 poles, which makes it easier to get into the right position. Considering the ground is just a flat texture, I think it's fair to say it was placed there on purpose. Skull markers are removed on every difficulty for Captain Blue, presumably because you have to beat Ultra V rated to unlock him anyway. This is an example of the uppercut auto cancels I mentioned earlier. If you use it on their front rather than their back, then you can milk a ton of points from Jelbies this way. The targeting reticule for Rock-On is a circle broken into quadrants with alternating colours. If it was black and yellow instead of pink, it would be a crash test dummy symbol. I'm not sure why I don't get shot by this Cromarty in the sewers. Maybe because the bullet leaves the end of the chamber, so if you happen to jump into one at the right moment, it misses. Needless to say, whatever the cause, I'm grateful for it. It looks like a mistake that I have to backtrack for the key here, but it's not. If you have the key, it's hard to fight in the corridor without opening the elevator, which causes the encounter to be ranked. I delay getting the key so I can score points in the hallway first. If you were wondering why I ended the mega combo before killing the black leaders, it's because, unfortunately, their introduction cutscene interrupts it anyway. There's a blink and you'll miss it dodge during the Grand Bruce rematch where a bomb drops in front of me right before it explodes. This is the only time this ever happened to me, so the speed I responded to such an unexpected event is one of the things I'm most proud of in this video. During the final boss, the cloth dynamics on the capes are altered so they move like they're in zero gravity. Doesn't make much sense since the gameplay is identical, but at least it looks beautiful. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was Viewtiful Joe. I'll be honest and say that I overlooked this game when it came out, and even when I tried it years later, I didn't really give it a fair shake at first. As part of the Hideki Kamiya catalogue, it's overshadowed by Devil May Cry on one side and Ōkami on the other. I hope I've made at least one thing clear in this video. Viewtiful Joe isn't some stopgap or footnote. It's an excellent game in its own right, and the more I think about it, the more I think this might just be the clearest example of the kind of fingerprints Kamiya leaves on his games, only natural given the small team size, I suppose. An intuitive control scheme, a transparent 2-part scoring system, encounter variety built through various means, and a novel central mechanic which provides a fresh experience. Let's just say this isn't the last time those things will be prioritized in one of Kamiya's titles. Devil May Cry set a precedent which other action games would go on to follow, but Viewtiful Joe set many precedents which Kamiya would go on to follow. If you give this game the time it deserves, you might come to feel that those aspects are worth valuing just as much. Last time around, I encouraged you to tackle some kind of challenge run for yourself. Hopefully you took me up on that offer and had a good time. If not, then I'd like to remind you that the one thing a hero needs more than anything is perseverance. Anyway, I have a different call to action for you this time. It's ironic that Captain Blue's motivation stems from the feeling that his work was disregarded as a fad, when Viewtiful Joe itself would go on to become wedged between 2 much more highly regarded titles. Sometimes I worry that games are too disposable. Certain classics are still well regarded after decades, but other equally good ones get left by the wayside. Games are meant to be played and enjoyed to their fullest, but we need to make sure we take some time to talk about our favourites so they can still be appreciated by others in the future. After all, a game only exists for as long as people continue to play it. So if you're up for it, take some time to think about why it is you value some lesser known game and try to express that to others in a way which gets them interested. I'm not saying you have to run out and make a 3-hour commentary, but just a little something that explains the appeal to help others gain a greater appreciation for what makes it special. You never know, you might just be the one who saves it from fading into obscurity. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed my little film, but it's time for me to take a bow. Until next time, stay beautiful.